Hello and welcome. Whether you're listening in the quiet of the night or resting in a gentle pause during the day, this calm journey invites you to step into a world slowly finding its balance again. Make yourself comfortable, let your breathing soften and slow. Allow the weight of the present to ease as we drift back to a time when silence followed sorrow and humanity began the quiet work of healing. This is the world after the 1918 influenza pandemic, a serene, reflective exploration of how life resumed after a global moment of loss. Take a slow, steady breath. As you exhale, imagine streets growing busier once more, sunlight returning to hospital windows, and homes opening after long months of grief. The pandemic has passed, leaving behind absence, memory, and change. In this peaceful retelling, there is no fear, no urgency, only gentle observation. We move slowly through the aftermath, noticing how societies mourned, adapted, and cautiously stepped forward. Picture yourself standing at the edge of an awakening world. The air feels clearer, filled with the quiet sounds of daily life returning. Footsteps, conversation, distant laughter. Memorials are simple. Grief is shared softly. Though you remain safe and comfortable where you are, you may sense the fragile resilience that spread across nations, binding people together through shared experience. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore what followed the 1918 influenza pandemic, how public health evolved, how communities changed, and how culture, memory, and everyday life were reshaped by survival. We'll move gently through these moments, letting history unfold like a calm dawn after a long night. For now, settle in, breathe deeply, and allow this peaceful journey into the post-pandemic world to begin. Introduction. Aftermath of a global catastrophe. In the autumn of 1918, as the guns of the First World War fell silent, another enemy was ravaging the world's population, a deadly influenza pandemic. Over the course of 1918 and 1919, the disease known as the Spanish flu infected nearly one-third of the global population and killed at least 50 million people, with some estimates soaring to 100 million. No corner of the earth was spared. In the United States alone, about 675,000 people lost their lives, causing the nation's average life expectancy to drop by 12 years in 1918. Across the ocean in Britain, some 228,000 perished, making 1918 the first year on record in which deaths exceeded births in the UK. Elsewhere, the toll defied comprehension. South Africa lost about 140,000 people, mostly black South Africans, and entire communities that were reportedly wiped out. India endured the worst loss of all, an estimated 12 to 18 million deaths in a matter of months. In town after town, on every continent, families counted empty chairs at the table, and communities struggled to cope with a disaster more lethal than even the Great War. This influenza pandemic struck in 3 relentless waves. A relatively mild first wave in the spring of 1918 gave little warning of what was to come. In late August 1918, a second wave exploded with ferocity, spreading globally through the late autumn. The vast majority of deaths occurred in just 13 weeks, between mid-September and mid-December 1918. A third wave in early 1919 was less extreme than the second, but still deadly, flaring in communities already weakened by war and disease. The pandemic's timing amid the final battles of World War I was cruelly ironic. Troop movements and crowded military camps became efficient incubators for the virus. Indeed, Historians note that the 1918 flu may have hastened the end of the war, as both Allied and Central Power forces were debilitated by illness in the conflict's closing months. The name Spanish flu was a misnomer born of wartime censorship, Spain, being neutral, freely reported on the outbreak, while belligerent nations suppressed bad news, but the disease did not spare Spain or any other land. For those who survived the great influenza, the experience was life-changing. Society was already exhausted by 4 years of war. Now an invisible plague had stolen young mothers and fathers, robust soldiers, and even children in a matter of days. Unlike typical influenza outbreaks that mainly claim the very old and very young, this strain killed an unusually high number of healthy young adults in the prime of life. Hospitals overflowed with the sick, and in many places medical care was overwhelmed. In a U.S. Army camp near Boston, a doctor wrote in late September 1918 of the horror he witnessed. These men start with what appears to be an attack of la grippe, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. Even for battle-hardened physicians, the sight of patients turning blue from lack of oxygen and dying by the dozens each day was shattering. Undertakers ran out of coffins. Morgues overflowed. In that same army camp, bodies had to be stacked in an empty building until special trains could carry away the dead. Such scenes were repeated in city after city, an almost unimaginable scale of death in an age before modern intensive care. Yet in the pandemic's wake, the world did not collapse. People persevered through grief and hardship, and slowly communities began to rebuild. The world, after the 1918 influenza pandemic, is a story of both devastating loss and profound transformation. It is a story told in quiet cemetery vigils and in ambitious public health reforms, in shattered families, and in new scientific discoveries. In the 1920s, the world entered a period of recovery and change, determined, whether consciously or not, to learn from the catastrophe and to honor the lives lost by forging a better future. In the sections that follow, we will explore how different regions, the United States, Europe, South Asia, especially British-ruled India, and other colonial territories, emerged from the shadow of the influenza pandemic. We will see how public health was reimagined and the field of epidemiology was born, how governments responded and what that meant for public trust, how societies mourned and often tried to forget the social and psychological trauma, how economies faltered and then recovered in the post-war world, how the pandemic affected labor, urban life, and demographics, how it spurred advances in scientific research and medical education, and how writers, artists, and musicians found cultural expression for an event that had been so vast and amorphous that many simply called it the forgotten pandemic. Through it all, we maintain a serene lens, looking back a century to understand how humanity found hope and resilience after one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Before diving into these thematic explorations, let us take a brief moment to consider the global scale of the pandemic's impact. From the high Andes to remote Arctic villages, influenza left few communities untouched. In Western Samoa, a Polynesian territory under New Zealand's administration, the virus arrived by ship in November 1918 and proved catastrophic. Within 2 months, it killed about 22% of the population. By contrast, American Samoa, under a strict quarantine imposed by its U.S. naval governor, avoided even a single influenza death in 1918. Such stark differences fueled anger and cries of negligence in places that suffered grievously. In colonial India, the pandemic swept through a population already weakened by poor nutrition and recent famine. Villages in the Punjab and elsewhere experienced apocalyptic scenes. In one report, the streets and lanes of the cities were littered with dead and dying people. Nearly every household was lamenting a death, and everywhere terror and confusion reigned. The sheer scale of mortality in India, roughly 5% of the population perished in a matter of months, was more than the cumulative Indian fatalities in several decades of plague and far exceeded the death toll of the war. In the words of Mahatma Gandhi, who himself fell ill but survived, the epidemic felt like a punishment of God on Western civilization for its arrogance and colonial sins. In Africa, too, devastation was often disproportionately borne by indigenous communities. South Africa's black townships were so hard hit that newspapers described Cape Town as a city of the dead, with some native districts reportedly entirely depopulated by the flu. And in the far north, an Alaskan Inuit village named Brevig Mission became tragically famous. Within 5 days, in November 1918, the flu wiped out 72 of the village's 80 inhabitants, a 90% mortality rate. These grim episodes underscore a theme that will recur in our story. The pandemic illuminated deep inequities in the world of 1918, sparing neither prince nor peasant, but exacting its heaviest price on the poor, the colonized, and the vulnerable. Against this backdrop of sorrow, the world in the 1920s faced a fundamental question. What next? How would societies that had endured such a double cataclysm, world war and global plague, move forward? The answer, as we shall see, unfolded in reforms and innovations that still shape our lives today. A century later, looking back with calm reflection, we can discern the legacy of the 1918 influenza in our hospitals and public health systems, in scientific knowledge and cultural memory, and in the very way communities conceive of their collective responsibility for health. In a quiet, measured tone, let us now explore these legacies theme by theme, discovering how the world, after the 1918 pandemic, was reborn from the ashes of an unspeakable tragedy, public health reforms, and the birth of modern epidemiology. The 1918-1919 influenza pandemic was a devastating destroyer, but in its aftermath it also became a stern teacher. One of the clearest lessons learned was that health could no longer be left to individual effort alone or to fragmented charity. The scale of the crisis demanded coordinated, collective action. In the 1920s, many countries fundamentally reformed their public health systems, giving rise to what we now recognize as modern epidemiology and public health infrastructure. It was as if the world, shocked by the flu's ravages, finally grasped that preventing disease was as vital as treating it. In a calm wave of reform, governments established health ministries, expanded access to medical care, and began systematically collecting health data to guide policy. Perhaps the most consequential change was the spread of the idea of universal health care, that the state should ensure medical care for all citizens, not only the affluent. In Russia, the newly formed Soviet government created a centralized public health system in 1918-1920, aiming to provide free medical care funded by the state. Not long after, other nations followed suit. Britain, France, and Germany all took steps in the 1920s to consolidate healthcare and broaden access, moving towards socialized medicine in various forms. In Britain, for instance, a Ministry of Health was established in 1919, elevating public health leadership into the national cabinet for the first time. This move was a direct response to the pandemic, during which British health officials had lacked authority and resources. Never again would an epidemic be managed without a central organizing body. In Germany and France, which already had some social insurance systems pre-war, the post-pandemic years saw those systems strengthened and greater emphasis placed on preventive care. Even in the United States, a country traditionally wary of government-run medicine, the aftermath of the flu pandemic spurred important changes. The U.S. did not create a national health service, but it did begin to invest in public health at all levels. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, states and cities expanded their health departments, and employer-based health insurance plans slowly grew, a trend that accelerated later. All of these reforms shared a common philosophy: health is a social responsibility. The pandemic had proven that one person's illness could quickly become a community's problem. Public health agencies that we take for granted today often trace their roots to this era. Many countries either created or overhauled national public health institutes in direct response to the 1918 flu. For example, the League of Nations, the world's first intergovernmental organization, formed a health organization in 1921, recognizing that controlling epidemics required global cooperation. In Vienna, an international bureau for fighting epidemics opened in 1919, serving as an early network for sharing disease intelligence across borders. These initiatives were forerunners of today's World Health Organization. After seeing a virus circumnavigate the globe with ease, policymakers understood that no country could stand alone against pandemic threats. Contagious diseases, as one observer noted in 1919, didn't respect borders, so nations began pooling resources and information to monitor influenza and other infections. This was a radical departure from the pre-1918 approach, where health matters were often considered a domestic issue, and international coordination was minimal. At the local and national level, health officials implemented permanent changes inspired by their wartime failures and successes. During the pandemic, many cities had belatedly adopted measures like closing schools, banning public gatherings, and requiring masks, which helped slow the spread. In the 1920s, those experiences informed new public health policies. For instance, influenza and other respiratory illnesses were made notifiable diseases in many jurisdictions, meaning doctors were required to report cases to health authorities. This was a crucial reform. In 1918, influenza's rapid spread went untracked at first because it was not reportable, delaying responses. Never again would health officials be blind to an emerging epidemic in that way. Cities also enacted ongoing public hygiene ordinances. Campaigns against spitting in the streets to curb germ spread intensified, and some places maintained the habit of discouraging large indoor crowds during peak flu season. While mask mandates were dropped once the emergency passed, much to the relief of a mask-weary public, the notion of community-wide measures to prevent disease had entered the public health playbook for good. The pandemic also catalyzed the emergence of epidemiology as a modern science. In 1918, tracking and analyzing an epidemic's progression was a new endeavor. Health departments had just begun systematically collecting data on births, deaths, and diseases, and many rural areas had no such records at all. The influenza catastrophe changed that. In the United States, the U.S. Public Health Service undertook one of history's first large-scale epidemiological surveys in late 1918. Teams of researchers were sent house to house in 12 states, ultimately surveying 113,000 people to figure out how many had fallen ill and died. This monumental effort, led by physician-statisticians Wade Hampton Frost and Edgar Seidenstricker, introduced new statistical methods to estimate the true toll of the epidemic. Lacking complete death counts, many rural deaths went unrecorded, Frost devised an excess mortality calculation, comparing deaths during the pandemic to normal years, to estimate how many lives were lost. This was the first use of the excess death method for an epidemic, a method still used today by epidemiologists to gauge the impact of outbreaks. Frost's rigorous analysis concluded that the flu had caused roughly 54 additional deaths per 1,000 people in the U.S., atop the baseline mortality, a staggering figure that translated to about 500,000 excess deaths nationally. This kind of quantitative analysis was groundbreaking, and it gave public health officials a clearer picture than ever before of an epidemic's dynamics. The survey work did more than count the dead. It trained a new generation of disease detectives. In 1919, impressed by these efforts, the Rockefeller Foundation and other institutions began funding schools of public health and epidemiology. The Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health, which had opened in 1916, saw its enrollment and resources jump after the pandemic as students from around the world arrived eager to study the latest methods in public health, particularly in the brand new fields of epidemiology, virology, and immunology. Wade Hampton Frost himself became America's first professor of epidemiology at Hopkins in 1919, teaching what he called shoe leather epidemiology, pounding the pavement to track every case in an outbreak. Other universities followed, establishing epidemiology departments in the 1920s. In effect, the flu pandemic jump-started epidemiology as a formal discipline. Never again would public health rely on guesswork alone. Careful data collection, statistical analysis, and field investigations became standard practice, forming the foundation of modern disease surveillance. Around the world, similar currents were flowing. In Great Britain, the pandemic underscored the need for better organized health services. The new Ministry of Health, led initially by Sir Christopher Addison, took charge of coordinating epidemic response, sanitation, and hospitals across the country. Local medical officers of health, who had been important during the outbreak, were given greater support and clearer protocols for reporting infectious diseases. Britain also expanded its public health laboratory network in the 1920s, aiming to improve the detection of pathogens, a direct outgrowth of frustration at not knowing what microbe had caused the flu. In France, the Office International d'Hygiène Publique, OIHP, an existing international health office, was energized by the pandemic to increase the sharing of epidemiological intelligence, especially regarding influenza recurrences. In British India, where colonial authorities had been overwhelmed by the crisis, there were calls, largely from Indian physicians and leaders, to invest more in public health for the masses. The colonial government did take some steps. It improved the Indian Medical Research Fund, precursor to the Indian Council of Medical Research, and began more systematic recording of vital statistics in the 1920s. However, reforms in India lagged behind those in Europe or America, contributing to continued health disparities, an issue that would fuel discontent as Indians contrasted British indifference during the flu with the promises of a civilizing empire. One of the pandemic's paradoxical gifts to public health was that it accelerated scientific cooperation. Researchers from different countries began comparing notes on influenza in ways they never had before. At medical conferences in the early 1920s, the 1918 experience was a constant reference point. How had various cities fared? Which interventions worked best? These discussions yielded some of the first evidence-based public health recommendations. For instance, a 1919 analysis by the American Public Health Association compared cities that closed gathering places early to those that delayed, noting that timely action seemed to reduce peak death rates. Though some of these studies were crude by modern standards, they set a precedent for learning from the data of past outbreaks. It is also worth noting the gentle but important shift in public health philosophy after 1918. Before the pandemic, as the historian Laura Spinney observes, many elites believed illness was largely a failure of personal responsibility or inferior stock, reflecting the era's faith in eugenics and social Darwinism. The poor who died in slums were often blamed for their own plight. The influenza pandemic undermined that narrative. It became evident that poverty and lack of access to care, not moral or genetic failings, had predisposed certain populations to higher mortality. Public health, therefore, had to protect everyone to protect society at large. As one report bluntly concluded in 1920, pandemics are a social problem, not an individual one. This represented a more compassionate, collective approach to health, one that slowly opened the door for 20th century advances like widespread vaccination programs, maternal and child health services, and government-funded clinics. Policemen in Seattle, USA, wearing masks made by the Red Cross during the 1918 influenza epidemic, December 1918. Public health measures, like mask mandates and bans on public gatherings, introduced during the crisis, became precedents for future epidemic responses. Many such measures were lifted after the pandemic waned, but they left a legacy of preparedness and the recognition that non-medical interventions can save lives. In sum, the world after 1918 entered a new era in public health. The pandemic's legacy was visible in the creation of health ministries, the professionalization of epidemiology, the expansion of healthcare access, and the ethos that public health authorities must be empowered and proactive. Quietly and often behind the scenes, these changes made societies more resilient. When later generations faced new epidemics, polio in mid-century, or other flu pandemics in 1957 and 1968, they benefited from the foundations laid in the 1920s. The calm, methodical work of building health institutions was a direct answer to the chaos of 1918. It is no exaggeration to say that today's public health systems, from the Centers for Disease Control to the WHO, trace a line back to the reforms born in the ashes of the Spanish flu. The world had learned a hard lesson and was determined not to be caught utterly unprepared again. Government responses and public trust in institutions. The influenza pandemic posed an immense challenge not only to medical science, but also to governance. How governments responded, or failed to respond, had lasting repercussions on public trust. In the immediate aftermath, many people around the world asked, did our leaders do enough? Were we told the truth? The answers varied by country and region. In some places, effective action during the crisis bolstered confidence in authorities. In others, mishandling and neglect bred skepticism or even outright anger. Over time, these perceptions would shape civic relationships and political developments, especially in colonial contexts, where the pandemic became another grievance against imperial rule. In the tranquil light of hindsight, we can observe how the pandemic acted as a stress test for governments, revealing both strengths and weaknesses in their commitment to public welfare. During the height of the pandemic in 1918, government actions were often hampered by war priorities and poor communication. In the United States and much of Europe, wartime censorship meant that officials downplayed the outbreak's severity initially, fearing damage to morale. Newspapers in the U.S., for example, printed reassuring messages in early fall 1918, just the old grip, even as hospitals quietly overflowed. This lack of transparency, understandable in the war context, nonetheless cost trust. After the war, as the truth of the pandemic's scale emerged, some citizens felt misled by their leaders. In Britain, one scholar noted an air of fatalism during the pandemic. People were so inured to wartime death and so kept in the dark by scant official data that they resigned themselves to the flu as an unstoppable force. The British government's public briefings were minimal, and data on deaths were not regularly published in 1918, starkly different from the data-heavy press conferences we expect today. The consequence was a kind of public numbness. Many Britons simply carried on, as advised by officials like Sir Arthur Newshome, the chief medical officer, who famously urged that national duty required business as usual despite the epidemic. This stiff upper lip approach avoided panic, but also stifled public discussion of the tragedy. In the long run, it contributed to the pandemic being less commemorated, almost suppressed in public memory, and this absence of public grief has been noted by historians as a missed opportunity for collective healing. However, the lack of commemoration or public inquiry in Britain did not immediately translate into a collapse of trust. Interestingly, many people in 1919 seemed to turn the page quickly, perhaps too exhausted by war and flu to dwell on recriminations. The British state faced criticism for specific failings, like inadequate nursing staff or medical supplies. But those critiques were muted compared to the political and economic storms of the post-war period. Over time, though, some argued that by not openly reckoning with the pandemic, the government left the populace psychologically unprepared for future outbreaks. In essence, trust in institutions wasn't shattered in 1919, but a kind of collective amnesia set in that had its own costs. In the United States, government response varied at federal, state, and city levels, leading to a patchwork of outcomes and trust levels. The U.S. federal government in 1918 had a limited role in public health. The Surgeon General and the Public Health Service provided information and some assistance, such as deploying doctors to hard-hit locales, but there was no coordinated national shutdown or mandate, decisions were largely left to local authorities. Some cities, like St. Louis, acted decisively, closing schools and banning gatherings early, and were later praised for lower death rates. Others, like Philadelphia, were notoriously late to respond, even allowing a big wartime parade to proceed, which became a deadly super-spreading event. These contrasts were not lost on the public. In the 1918-1919 aftermath, newspapers and civic groups discussed what went wrong in cities that fared poorly and credited proactive leadership where death tolls were kept down. This was an early glimmer of accountability in public health. For example, Dr. Rupert Blue, the Surgeon General, faced criticism in Congress for the lack of preparedness. Why were there shortages of nurses? Why did the pandemic catch the country by surprise? While the criticism didn't lead to dramatic punishment, it did influence future funding. In 1919 and 1920, Congress modestly increased appropriations to the Public Health Service and other health agencies, reflecting recognition that more federal coordination was needed in health emergencies. Public trust in American institutions did not collapse. Indeed, by the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties optimism swept much of the country. But a seed was planted that government had a rightful role in safeguarding health. Where trust truly eroded was in colonial contexts, where subjects already eyed their rulers with discontent. In British-ruled India, the government's pandemic response was widely seen as lethargic and insufficient. As the influenza raged through Indian cities and villages in late 1918, colonial authorities were slow to allocate resources. Medical personnel were scarce. Many Indian doctors and nurses had been sent to war fronts or were concentrated in urban hospitals, leaving rural areas defenseless. Requests by Indian leaders for more aid were often ignored, as the Raj focused on the war effort. The governor of Bombay candidly admitted in a report that we were caught unprepared. Indians noticed that while British officials often retreated to hill stations, healthier enclaves, to wait out the contagion, it was largely Indian volunteers and professionals who struggled to care for the sick on the ground. The native press in Bombay and other cities harshly criticized the government's indifference. Some newspapers even propagated the belief that the influenza was a plague sent by the British, a punishment for the growing Indian calls for self-rule. While that conspiracy theory was extreme, it reflected the deep distrust and resentment the pandemic magnified. Mahatma Gandhi's remark that the flu was divine retribution for colonial oppression, cited earlier, captured the moral indictment many felt. The pandemic struck India at a volatile political moment. In 1919, just months after the flu subsided, the British passed the repressive Rowlatt Acts, curbing civil liberties, sparking protests that culminated in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. In the eyes of Indian nationalists, the British Raj had failed at a basic duty, protecting the lives of its subjects, and then showed callousness by moving on without significant reforms or relief for survivors. This contributed to the erosion of legitimacy of colonial rule. As one Indian journal later reflected, the government's scant response to the flu silenced the deaths of millions and proved that Indian lives were cheap in the imperial calculus. Such sentiments helped fuel the growing independence movement through the 1920s. In a subtle but real way, the pandemic greased the wheels of decolonization. It exposed the moral failure of empire to many formerly loyal subjects. In other colonies, similar patterns emerged. In parts of Africa, under British, French, or Belgian rule, the native populations often received little assistance. For example, in South Africa, European settlers had somewhat better access to medical care or could isolate on farms, whereas black Africans living in crowded mining compounds or segregated urban areas died in droves with minimal help. After the pandemic, South African authorities did take some actions, like improving water and sanitation in townships, but the stark racial disparity in flu mortality, which the LSE blog noted, with some communities decimated, lingered in collective memory. This added to the grievances that would later coalesce into movements against colonial and racial injustice. In the Pacific, the fiasco in Western Samoa, where New Zealand administrators failed to quarantine an infected ship, causing the deaths of over 1/5 of Samoans, permanently tarnished New Zealand's colonial record. Samoans' bitterness at this avoidable tragedy fed into resistance against colonial rule, the Mau movement, and it is telling that even decades later, New Zealand officially apologized for its role in the 1918 Samoa pandemic. Conversely, the American Samoa example, where a naval governor's decisive quarantine saved lives, became a point of pride and improved trust in that local administration. These contrasting outcomes reinforced the idea that competent governance in a crisis earns trust, while incompetence or neglect can ignite long-lasting anger. Despite regional differences, one overarching shift was afoot. Governments realized they had to be more proactive about public health, or they would face public disillusionment. The pandemic taught a new generation of politicians that ignoring a health crisis could be as politically dangerous as ignoring an economic or military crisis. This lesson manifested in various ways. In democracies like Britain and the US, it wasn't immediate. There was no 1918 equivalent of a pandemic commission with sweeping reform to streets, but gradually health moved up the political agenda. By the late 1920s and 1930s, public health had become a standard part of governance, with budgets and plans in place, partly because leaders knew their citizens expected them to prevent another nightmare. In more autocratic settings, the lesson was often internalized as a need for better control of information and resources to handle epidemics. For instance, the Soviet Union invested heavily in public sanitation and propaganda about hygiene to show that the state could shield its people from disease, even as, ironically, it covered up later epidemics for the sake of its image. Another subtle effect on trust was the way the pandemic blurred the lines between scientific authority and government authority. In 1918, many top health experts, like the U.S. Surgeon General or Britain's Chief Medical Officer, had given optimistic or false assurances early on, reflecting their limited knowledge. After the pandemic, there was some public cynicism about experts who had seemed powerless. This could have eroded trust in medicine, but instead it often galvanized efforts to make medicine more trustworthy by basing it on research and evidence. We see in the 1920s a stronger emphasis on scientific credentials in public office. For example, medical doctors were frequently appointed to head new health ministries, rather than lay bureaucrats, to assure the public that qualified people were at the helm. The trust that had been dented was slowly rebuilt by visibly putting science into governance. Internationally, the League of Nations Health Organization's work sharing data on outbreaks, standardizing vaccines and serums, helped restore confidence that humanity would not be so blind again. When a minor influenza outbreak occurred in 1920-21 in Europe, health officials communicated more openly, and people were reassured that it was being monitored. In reflection, the pandemic's immediate aftermath was not marked by loud blame games, apart from in the colonial world, but by a quiet recalibration of expectations. The public, having gone through an ordeal largely without modern precedent, came to expect more from their governments in guarding health. Governments, in turn, recognized that public health was integral to national security and societal stability. This mutual understanding slowly built a stronger social contract around health, one that persists to this day. A century later, during the COVID-19 crisis, many commentators looked back to 1918 and noted that one reason the 1918 flu faded from memory is that people entrusted the task of never again to institutions, and those institutions, for the most part, did evolve. It is poignant to consider that trust, once shaken, was not irrevocably lost, but rather became a catalyst for change. To be sure, not all was rosy in the interwar period. The economic hardships and political turmoil of the 1920s and 1930s, inflation, the Great Depression, the rise of totalitarian regimes, often overshadowed discussions of the pandemic. But in the background, the relationship between citizens and the state regarding health had been altered. Public health became seen as a core government responsibility, much like defense or education. This was a pillar of the renewed public trust, the idea that we are all in this together and the government should lead collective action in health emergencies. If 1918 had shown the tragic cost of unpreparedness, the following decades were an exercise in institutional learning and rebuilding trust through readiness. In summary, government responses to the 1918 pandemic and their effect on public trust were a study in contrasts. In Western nations, initial missteps were gradually compensated by reforms and a forward-looking approach that maintained or even strengthened trust in the long run. In colonized regions, the pandemic often exposed callous governance, accelerating a loss of faith in imperial authorities and fueling independence sentiments. Across the board, leaders learned that honesty and prompt action in health crises are crucial to retain the public's confidence. The people who lived through the pandemic learned something too. They learned to demand competence and care from those in power when it came to health. It was a lesson quietly absorbed, one that would shape how societies reacted to public health measures in the decades to follow. The next time a mass vaccination campaign or a quarantine was proposed, people were more likely to go along, not out of blind faith, but out of a sober understanding born in 1918 that, when facing invisible deadly foes, trustworthy institutions are humanity's best defense. Grief, trauma, and the shadow on society. In the wake of the pandemic, an ocean of grief blanketed communities around the world. Nearly everyone had lost a family member, a friend, a neighbor, or knew someone who had. Yet the mourning that followed the influenza pandemic was strikingly subdued and private. Unlike the Great War, which immediately inspired public monuments, victory parades, and an annual Armistice Day of remembrance, the flu dead were largely left without collective memorials. Societies were eager to turn the page, perhaps too eager. The result was a curious silence in the public sphere, what some historians have called the forgotten pandemic, even as countless individuals quietly struggled with trauma and loss. In this section, we explore how people coped emotionally and culturally with the aftermath of such widespread death, and how the pandemic's memory, or lack thereof, shaped the post-1918 world in subtle ways. In 1918-1919, normal rituals of grief were often disrupted by the sheer scale of mortality. During the worst months, many could not hold proper funerals. Gatherings were banned, and cemeteries were overwhelmed. Families sometimes had to bury their dead without ceremony, or in places like India, cremate multiple bodies on hastily built pyres, as fuel for cremation ran short. This left emotional scars. People had been denied the comfort of traditional leave-takings. When the crisis finally ebbed, there was a backlog of sorrow, millions of individual heartbreaks that had to find an outlet or be quietly endured. One contemporary observer in the United States wrote, "There was no family that didn't know a funeral, yet astonishingly, there were few public memorials for the influenza victims. Communities that erected grand statues for their war heroes seldom did the same for the flu's fallen." In Britain, as Martin Bailey notes, the Spanish flu went uncommemorated. No national day of mourning, no cenotaph for the influenza dead. This absence was not because the pain was any less. Rather, it seems that the pandemic's victims slipped through the cracks of collective memory. One reason was that dying of flu carried no patriotic narrative or heroic imagery. It was seen as an unfortunate, mundane fate, not an act of valor. Another reason was simply trauma and fatigue. People were so overwhelmed by back-to-back catastrophes that once the flu was gone, they wanted to forget it, to look ahead to life and joy rather than dwell on the dark year of 1918. For many survivors, however, forgetting was impossible. Psychological trauma lingered beneath the surface of the roaring new decade. Parents grieved children who would never grow up. Young women grieved fiancés they would never marry. So common was this that a generation of single women in some towns were quietly referred to as surplus women, a term more often used for war widows, but applicable to flu too. Children who lost both parents to influenza, and there were many, were raised by relatives or placed in orphanages, carrying forward a loss that would shape their lives. Yet these stories rarely made headlines. Instead, they lived in diaries, letters, and family lore. For example, letters from rural Iowa in 1919, later discovered in one family's attic, speak in plain, heartbroken language of daily life under grief. There isn't a single home on our road that didn't lose someone. One letter reads, "We just keep breathing and going on, because what else can we do?" In New England, a teenager wrote in her diary of attending funeral after funeral, at one point noting from 5 who had influenza, 2 deaths in a single family. Such quiet notations echo across countless journals of the time, a mosaic of private mourning that historians only later piece together. Despite the lack of formal memorials, communities did develop informal ways of remembering and honoring those lost. In some churches, plaques or stained glass windows were quietly dedicated to influenza victims. Families sometimes listed 1918 influenza on tombstones, though many simply recorded the year of death, which itself became an eerie marker. In cemeteries, one can see clusters of gravestones, all with the year 1918, a silent testimony to the pandemic's toll. Some cities held days of prayer or thanksgiving when the pandemic finally waned. For instance, in parts of the United States, November 1918, when the second wave ended and the war ended, saw impromptu church services both mourning the dead and celebrating survival. But these observances were local and not repeated annually. By the early 1920s, there was a palpable societal push to move forward and not dwell on the tragedy. The reasons were understandable. People had endured enough horror between war and plague and craved normalcy and joy. The roaring 20s in Western countries can be partly seen as a psychological reaction, a determination to embrace life, fun, and prosperity in defiance of the shadow of death that had so recently loomed. Contemporary writers described the 1920s as a time of feverish gaiety. One could interpret that partly as a coping mechanism. Those who survived wanted to live life at full tilt, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die might have felt very real to a 25-year-old who had seen their peers felled by unseen germs. Yet underneath the parties and progress, the trauma of the pandemic did leave deeper imprints. One such imprint was an increased cultural fascination with mortality and the fragility of life, often expressed in art and literature in indirect ways. The 1920s saw the rise of spiritualism, people trying to contact lost loved ones via seances, which had begun after World War I, but likely got another boost from pandemic grief. Literary scholars suggest that some of the disillusionment and existential questioning characteristic of the interwar lost generation was fed not just by the trenches of the war, but also by the inexplicable mass death of the flu. For instance, novelist Catherine Ann Porter nearly died of influenza in 1918 and lost her beloved fiancé to it. In 1939, she channeled that experience into her haunting short novel, Pale Horse, Pale Rider. The story follows a young woman, Miranda, who falls ill during the pandemic and hallucinates about death on a pale horse, a biblical image of plague. Miranda survives, but awakens to find her lover has died, a mirror of Porter's own life. Porter's prose captures the surreal, dreamlike trauma of surviving an illness that has killed so many. The road to death is a long march, beset with all evils, but she is not afraid, only marveling at the multitudes of the dead, Miranda thinks, as she drifts near death. When Porter published this work, she was giving voice, finally, to the suppressed sorrow of 1918. Critics at the time recognized its power. Today it stands as one of the clearest literary memorials of the pandemic's emotional toll. Other writers and artists touched on the pandemic more obliquely. The poet T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland in 1922, a poem saturated with images of sterility, death, and disillusionment. While Eliot's primary inspiration was the war and personal turmoil, it's often noted that he composed parts of the poem while nursing his wife through the flu, and that one famous line, "April is the cruelest month," might reflect the cruel spring of 1919, when renewal did not come for so many. In Ireland, poet W.B. Yeats wrote of a world falling apart. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. During this period, his wife Georgie had nearly died of influenza while pregnant in 1918, an ordeal that finds echoes in the chaos of his verse. Visual art, too, bore marks of the pandemics. The Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, who contracted Spanish flu in 1919, painted a striking self-portrait titled Self-Portrait with the Spanish Flu. In it, we see the artist seated in a sick room, gaunt and weary, wrapped in a robe. The colors are pale and subdued, conveying weakness and isolation. Munch depicted himself not heroically but vulnerably, a man who has looked death in the face. He survived, and the painting stands as a testament to that brush with mortality. Likewise, Austrian artist Egon Schiele made a sketch of his ailing wife Edith in bed in October 1918. Tragically, Edith, who was 6 months pregnant, died of influenza, and Schiele himself succumbed days later. His final sketches radiate despair and tenderness, capturing intimate moments of grief. The pandemic, though not often the central subject of art, colored the emotional palette of a generation of artists with tones of fragility, melancholy, and resilience. Edvard Munch, Self-Portrait with the Spanish Flu, 1919. Painted after the artist's own bout of influenza, this self-portrait shows Munch convalescing, pale-faced, seated in a chair with a blanket over his lap and an almost hollow look in his eyes. The painting's muted colors and quiet, introspective mood reflect the loneliness and fatigue of illness and recovery. It remains one of the few direct artistic portrayals of the 1918 pandemic's personal impact. In everyday social life, the pandemic's shadow manifested in small ways. Memorialization often took private forms, photo albums with black ribbons around pictures of the departed, or newborn children named after a relative who died in 1918, hoping to carry forward their memory. In some regions, folks made sense of their trauma by framing it in traditional or religious terms. For instance, communities in South Asia and Africa sometimes held ceremonies to pacify what they saw as the evil wind or the anger of gods that had brought the influenza. In Punjab, a poetic prayer by one Ram Singh Thind in 1919 personified the flu as a destructive force, but also an event under divine will. Religious faith was a comfort to many. Churches, temples, and mosques that had been closed during the contagion reopened to host well-attended services of thanksgiving, even as they also struggled to answer the theological question of why such suffering had occurred. Some clergy told their congregations that the pandemic was a test of faith or a punishment for worldly sins, echoing older interpretations of plague. Others emphasized God's mercy in sparing those who survived. Either way, these narratives helped some people contextualize their grief within a larger cosmic framework, which can be a source of solace. A notable psychological effect of the pandemic was a widespread resolve to live for today, as tomorrow was not guaranteed. This fed into the social dynamics of the 1920s. Young adults, in particular, having seen death strike their healthy peers, felt an urgency to seize opportunities. The result wasn't always hedonistic. For some, it meant pursuing education or careers they were passionate about, since life could be cut short. For others, it meant marrying and starting families sooner, to fill the voids left by loss or simply to grasp happiness. Demographers noted a mini baby boom in 1920 in some countries, possibly a rebound from the flu's depressed birth rates in 1919. Couples who delayed having children during the dangerous pandemic year seemed to compensate afterward. For example, Britain's birth rate, which had dropped in 1918, jumped significantly in 1919 as war and flu ended, and neutral countries showed a similar bust-then-boom pattern. Each new life born was a tangible sign of renewal and hope, helping families to heal. Still, even as new life came, some survivors carried invisible wounds. We would now recognize some of their symptoms as post-traumatic stress. In 1920s literature, one occasionally finds characters who panic at the sound of a cough or who are seized by dread at the onset of autumn, recalling the deadly second wave. These are subtle hints of the psychological scars left by 1918. A few memoirists later in life admitted that they never overcame a certain anxiety that another deadly pandemic could strike any time. For many, the memory of 1918 was something they spoke of rarely, perhaps not wanting to revisit the horror. This silence, passed down through families, is one reason the pandemic story faded. It lived on more in subdued family anecdotes than loud public history. Interestingly, it was often only when survivors reached old age that they began to share their flu stories in more detail, as if enough time had to pass, and perhaps as if subsequent events, like World War II, had given some perspective. When the 50th anniversary of the pandemic came in 1968, coinciding by chance with another flu pandemic that year, a few newspapers interviewed elderly people about their 1918 memories, and the emotions were still raw. One American woman in her 70s recalled, "We didn't think we'd see Christmas 1918. When it was over, nobody wanted to talk about it." She described how her mother had made soup for sick neighbors day after day, yet never spoke of it later because it was too sad, an encapsulation of a generation's approach to the trauma. Do your duty, then bury the pain in silence. It is worth contemplating the societal implications of this subdued grief. Martin Bailey and others have argued that by failing to publicly commemorate the pandemic, societies potentially compromised their long-term resilience. Public rituals of mourning serve to acknowledge loss and can strengthen social bonds in the face of tragedy. After World War I, the rituals of remembrance, like Armistice Day silences, arguably helped nations process the collective trauma and reinforce unity. No comparable ritual existed for the flu. As a result, the losses were largely privatized. Some historians suggest this led to an absence of public grief that could have consequences for societal cohesion. Without open acknowledgement, some bereaved individuals may have felt isolated in their pain, as if the world wanted to sweep their loved ones under the rug of history. In the long run, this also meant that lessons of the pandemic were not as culturally ingrained as lessons of the war. For instance, by the 1950s and 1960s, few remembered the flu pandemic vividly, which may be one reason that public health preparedness wasn't as strong as it could have been, an argument some made decades later, saying that not commemorating 1918 left the country ill-prepared to confront later pandemics. On the other hand, one might argue that the quiet coping mechanisms displayed by communities in 1918-1919 were a testament to human resilience. People did find ways to honor their dead, if not through monuments, then through memories, through living better lives in their names, through small acts of kindness going forward. It was noted, for example, that volunteerism in the 1920s in certain areas increased. Perhaps those who survived felt a debt to serve others. Nurses who lived through the worst months often became lifelong advocates for public health nursing, motivated by what they had seen. Some families established charitable foundations or scholarships in memory of their lost members. The 1920s saw an expansion of philanthropic endowments, part of a broader trend of civic-minded giving. Memorialization did eventually come, but much later. In the 1990s and 2000s, as the last survivors passed away, historians and communities began to erect plaques and memorials to the 1918 flu victims, and novels and films belatedly took up the subject. But for the generation that lived through it, the pandemic remained mostly a dark, melancholic backdrop to the interwar years. Always there, seldom discussed. To them, the true memorial was the changed world they lived in, the faces missing from family reunions, the eyes that carried a hint of sorrow, even in laughter, the extra care a mother took when her child had a fever because she remembered a time when fevers stole children away. These were quiet memorials, written not in stone, but in the hearts of those who endured. In a gentle tone, we acknowledge that grief and trauma after the pandemic were both immense and inexpressible in full. Society's rush to normalcy provided a balm for some, but it also left certain wounds lightly stitched. And yet, from those wounds, some empathy did grow. The pandemic, coming on the heels of the war, contributed to a general sense of shared vulnerability. People had seen that death could come as a thief in the night, regardless of social standing. This realization, painful as it was, perhaps made some a bit more compassionate towards others. In the 1920s, there was a surge in social welfare efforts, like aid for widows and orphans, community clinics, etc., spurred partly by the war's aftermath, but arguably also by the pandemic's silent dead. Society had been humbled, and in that humility, there was an opportunity to care more for one another. Ultimately, the world after the 1918 influenza pandemic carried a shadow, a ghost pandemic in memory, but also stepped into the sunlight of the 1920s with determination. People mourned in silence and lived in color. They did not build many statues for the flu's victims, but in their hearts they carried them. As we fall asleep, hearing their story, perhaps the most calming thought is that life, though fragile, endured. The laughter returned, the music played again, children grew up, and in countless everyday moments, the resilience of the human spirit quietly triumphed over the despair of 1918. The pandemic's grief was vast, but so too was the love that people showed in nursing one another, the courage in facing each new day, and the resolve to remember by rebuilding. In that sense, even without grand memorials, the legacy of care and memory lived on in those who survived and in the better world they tried to create for their children. Economic disruption and post-war recovery. The influenza pandemic struck at a delicate moment for the global economy. The Great War had just ended, or was ending, leaving many nations economically strained, and now the sudden loss of millions of workers and consumers, combined with the dislocation of quarantines and illness, caused further upheaval. In the short term, the pandemic was like a violent storm battering an already unsteady ship. Factories, shops, and farms all over the world saw labor shortages as workers fell ill or died. Transport and supply chains were interrupted, and public life ground to a halt under gathering bans. Yet remarkably, the world economy did not sink. It absorbed the blow, and after a period of turbulence, sailed into a new decade of growth, for some countries at least. We will examine how the pandemic disrupted economies, large and small, and how recovery unfolded in the 1920s, paying attention to both the immediate economic pain and the longer-term adjustments in labor and industry. Our tone here remains calm and measured, noting the hardship, but also the resilience and adaptive spirit that characterize the post-pandemic recovery. In purely numerical terms, economists estimate that the 1918 flu pandemic caused a sharp but short-lived global recession. One extensive study of historical data finds that worldwide GDP fell by about 6% on average due to the pandemic, with private consumption dropping around 8%, declines comparable to a major modern recession. These contractions largely occurred in late 1918 and early 1919. Factories in many countries had to curtail production or close for weeks as influenza swept through their workforce. In the United States, for instance, steel mills, coal mines, and railroads, all vital industries, reported serious slowdowns in October 1918, the peak flu month, because so many employees were absent or ill. Shipping was delayed as crews were sick. Ports like New York and San Francisco struggled with understaffing when longshoremen and customs officers died or were bedridden. Retail sales plunged in many cities during quarantine periods. With no public events, theaters, or dinners out, people spent less. Small businesses, like local markets and shops, suffered from both the lack of customers and the illness of proprietors themselves. Farm harvests in late 1918 were also affected. For example, in India, an already poor monsoon harvest was worsened by the fact that many agricultural laborers were dead or too weak to work, leading to crops rotting in fields in some areas. However, these disruptions, severe as they were, tended to be short-term. By early 1919, as the pandemic's second wave subsided, many sectors rebounded. There was a kind of catch-up effect. Delayed shipments were delivered. People threw belated celebrations, like weddings that had been postponed, and spent money on those, and factories ramped back up to meet pent-up demand. Some contemporary observers noted that economic activity resumed with surprising vigor once the quarantines lifted, perhaps an eagerness to compensate for lost time. But the picture was complicated by the war's end. Demobilization of millions of soldiers in late 1918 and 1919 dumped a large labor force back home, just as industries were pivoting from wartime production to peacetime. This contributed to post-war recessions in 1919 to 1920 in several countries, making it hard to disentangle war and pandemic effects. In the United States, for example, after a brief post-armistice boom in late 1919, the economy entered a sharp recession in 1920 to 21. Unemployment spiked above 11%, and many prices that had inflated during the war collapsed, a deflationary correction. This forgotten depression of 1920-21 was partly a result of the Federal Reserve tightening money and the cooling of war demand, but the pandemic likely contributed by weakening demand and confidence in the immediate preceding year. Still, by 1922, the U.S. economy was growing robustly again, entering the prosperous 1920s. A notable trend was that areas hit harder by the pandemic sometimes experienced a slightly different economic trajectory. Studies suggest that regions with higher mortality saw some labor supply contraction, which could lead, paradoxically, to higher wages for certain workers in the years following. Fewer workers meant employers had to compete more and pay more to attract labor. One analysis in the U.S. found that manufacturing wages grew faster in states that had higher death rates, possibly reflecting this dynamic. For example, cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, which were hard hit, did not suffer long-term depression. Their industries, once the flu passed, actually faced strong demand and fewer available workers, which gave surviving workers more bargaining power. Indeed, 1919 was a year of widespread labor unrest in many countries. In the United States, unions grew and major strikes erupted: a national steel strike, a general strike in Seattle, a policeman's strike in Boston, among others. While these strikes had complex causes, including wartime inflation and the global wave of socialist fervor after the Russian Revolution, part of the backdrop was workers feeling emboldened. They had seen how essential their labor was to keep society running during the war and the pandemic, and many felt they deserved better pay and conditions in return. It's notable that some of the striking workers specifically cited health and safety concerns. For instance, nurses and teachers in 1919 agitated for better working conditions, perhaps galvanized by what they endured during the flu. In Europe, the immediate post-flu economy was deeply entwined with post-war rebuilding. Western Europe's economies struggled in 1919 to 1921 with war debts, damaged infrastructure, and adjusting to millions of demobilized soldiers. The flu's impact, while severe on a human level, did not drastically alter the overall economic trajectory set by those larger forces. It was like an extra gust of wind during an existing storm. Britain had some economic contraction in 1919, partially due to labor lost to flu and the war, but then had a short recovery before sliding into a recession in 1921. Germany, already in turmoil from defeat and political revolution, also suffered a flu wave, but its hyperinflation and economic chaos in the early 1920s were more a result of reparations and fiscal issues than the pandemic. France had to rebuild the devastated front regions. The flu was a footnote in its economic challenges relative to reconstructing towns and factories destroyed in battle. Thus, while the pandemic no doubt added difficulties, for instance, French agriculture and industry lost many skilled workers to flu, the overall narrative of Europe's early 1920s economy was dominated by war recovery and restructuring of production from wartime to peacetime. In the colonial world, the economic disruptions could be quite acute locally because many communities lacked buffers. In India, for example, some villages lost so many working-age adults that economic productivity fell sharply for a season or two. Historians have noted that in 1919 and 1920, parts of India saw an uptick in poverty and debt as surviving family members struggled to farm enough or had to borrow money to get by after the breadwinner's death. However, these micro-level tragedies didn't necessarily show up in macroeconomic indicators, which were rudimentary for colonies. The colonial export economies, such as jute, tea, or cotton, resumed as global trade picked back up by 1920, but the human cost in the villages was silently borne. In some African colonies, a similar story played out. The flu removed a significant portion of the workforce. In South Africa's mines, for instance, production temporarily plummeted in late 1918 as miners were ill or dying. But by 1920, the mines were back to full output, often by recruiting new workers from rural areas to replace those lost. These replacements sometimes came from even more marginalized groups, highlighting how the economy adjusted often on the backs of the poor. From a broad perspective, the post-pandemic recovery was aided by the fact that infrastructure and capital were largely intact. Unlike wars that destroy factories and railroads, the flu killed people but left physical assets standing. Once enough healthy workers were available, production could restart relatively quickly. Indeed, Some contemporary economic commentators in 1919 marveled at how quickly businesses bounced back. In the United States, the stock market, which had wobbled during the worst of the pandemic, actually ended higher in 1919. The Dow Jones Index rose by over 30% that year. Part of this was speculative enthusiasm after war's end, but it signaled that investors viewed the pandemic as a temporary shock, not a long-term depressor of profits. This confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. Many companies reported a strong rebound in 1919 profits after a rough autumn of 1918. The New York Fed later analyzed city data and found that interventions to fight the flu, like closing businesses, had no significant long-term negative effect on overall economic performance, and cities that acted aggressively against the virus had, if anything, better economic growth in the 1920s. This finding, a century later, was echoed during COVID-19 debates, but it essentially matches the historical record. The 1920s boom erased the pandemic slump for many economies, leaving little permanent scar on output graphs. However, while aggregated economies recovered, individual livelihoods often took longer to heal. Families that lost their main income, earner to flu, had to find new means to survive. In many cases, this meant women entering the workforce or extended family networks stepping in. For example, a widow with children in 1919 might take a job as a seamstress or clerk, or rely on relatives for support if available. Orphaned children might withdraw from school to work earlier than they otherwise would have. These microeconomic adjustments were part of the social fabric of recovery, though they don't show up in big statistics. They do show up in narratives. Letters from 1919 are full of lines like, "I am trying to manage the farm without John now," or "My sister has come to live with us to help with the children." Such adjustments were acts of quiet heroism that kept households afloat. We should also consider how the pandemic influenced economic policy thinking. In its aftermath, some policymakers acknowledged the importance of healthy populations for economic stability. Public health began to be seen as an economic investment, not just social charity. For instance, companies took note that during the flu, workplaces with better ventilation, or which offered medical care to employees, had fared better, fewer workers lost. This contributed to the 1920s trend of larger firms introducing employee health programs, on-site clinics, or sponsoring local hospitals, partly to improve productivity by keeping workers healthy. Insurance companies, hit hard by flu death payouts, also became advocates for public health measures and research, since they had a vested interest in preventing such losses. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, which lost $24 million paying out influenza death claims, famously funded a pioneering study and trial of pneumonia treatments post-pandemic. They even dispatched nurses to educate the public on hygiene thereafter, realizing that an upfront investment in community health could save huge sums in claims, a clear alignment of economic and health incentives that was sharpened by the pandemic experience. Another economic aspect is how the pandemic influenced labor supply and migration. In some regions, high mortality created temporary labor shortages that led to migration from other areas. After the flu, the United States saw continued migration of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities, the Great Migration, to fill industrial jobs. This was already ongoing due to war labor demand. But the flu's toll in some northern cities perhaps made the demand even more acute for fresh labor. Internationally, some colonial authorities encouraged migration to replenish lost workers. For example, plantations in Southeast Asia looked to import labor from elsewhere if local workforce numbers had declined. These movements were relatively small in the big picture, but they were part of how the global economy adjusted the human factor. It's also telling to look at GDP and life expectancy together. While GDP rebounded fairly quickly, life expectancy statistics in many countries took a dip in 1918 and then recovered. The U.S. life expectancy dropped from 51 years in 1917 to 39 in 1918, due largely to the spike in deaths among younger people, then bounced back to 55 in 1919. This remarkably swift recovery of life expectancy underscores that the pandemic, while horrific, was concentrated in time. Economically, it was analogous, a sharp drop and then a rebound to trend. To an economist peering at a century-long graph of economic output, 1918 and 1919 might appear as a V-shaped blip. But to those who lived through it, the losses were deeply felt. In the long run, however, there does not seem to have been a permanent loss of economic potential, unlike, say, the Black Death in medieval times, which erased a third of Europe's population and dramatically changed economic structures for generations. The Spanish flu's roughly 2 to 3% global mortality, while tragic, was not enough to fundamentally alter the course of the 20th century economy. The surviving workforce and the next generation were able to carry on production and innovation. In fact, some argue that the 1920s economic boom in the U.S. was partly fueled by the war's technological progress and the unleashing of pent-up consumer demand, forces that swamped any lingering drag from the pandemic. That said, on the individual level, there were winners and losers. The healthcare and funeral industries grimly saw booms during the pandemic. Undertakers and coffin makers were extraordinarily busy. Some even ran out of coffins, as letters recounted. After the pandemic, the surge subsided, but some funeral businesses had profited enough to expand. On the flip side, life insurance companies and pension funds were hit hard by payouts. Some smaller insurers went bankrupt, and others increased premiums afterward to recoup losses. Orphanages and charitable organizations had increased burdens caring for pandemic orphans and widows. Many of these charities later lobbied for more government support for social welfare, contributing to the gradual expansion of social services in the 1920s and 1930s. In colonial regions like India, the toll in lives was so high that it caused a noticeable dip in population growth for a couple of years. While the population recovered and continued to grow, India's population in the 1920s resumed its upward trend. The immediate economic effect was a loss of productivity and consumption equivalent to millions of adults gone. One could theorize that India's economy in the 1920s might have been more robust if those 12 to 18 million had lived. They would have grown food, woven textiles, built things, and bought things. The same goes for other hard-hit places. So in a sense, there was an opportunity cost to the pandemic, growth that didn't happen, inventions never made by minds that perished, businesses never founded. This is hard to quantify, but is part of the tragic calculus. Overall, however, the post-pandemic world economy proved resilient. By the mid-1920s, many countries experienced prosperity, or at least relative stability, with notable exceptions like parts of Central Eastern Europe suffering war aftershocks. The striking thing is how little the pandemic was mentioned in economic contexts afterward. It quickly became a past event. Governments did not launch major economic initiatives solely in response to the flu, no equivalent of a Marshall Plan or New Deal for pandemic recovery. Instead, they folded any pandemic-related needs into broader reconstruction plans. For example, European countries rebuilt housing and infrastructure for war reasons, but that new housing stock also incidentally replaced crowded old quarters that had been hotbeds for disease, thus economically and health-wise benefiting the society. In the U.S., the 1918 pandemic was soon overshadowed by the issues of prohibition, the automobile boom, and stock market speculation. One might see this as a kind of economic forgetting parallel to the social forgetting. Once recovery was underway, the flu was rarely invoked in economic policy debates or business forecasts. In summation, the world after the influenza pandemic saw short-term economic pain followed by a relatively rapid recovery and adaptation. The immediate disruptions were serious. Production halted, supply chains frayed, workers and consumers vanished. But within a year or two, the scars largely healed in macroeconomic terms. The Roaring Twenties rolled in, bringing growth and optimism, until the Great Depression at decade's end, an unrelated calamity. It's a testament to both the resilience of economic systems and the determination of people to rebuild. Factories roared back to life. Shops reopened with bustling crowds. Indeed, some historians note a surge in consumer spending when the pandemic was over, as people indulged in pleasures denied during quarantine, and markets found equilibrium. Yet while the numbers recovered, the lived reality for many included an empty chair at the dinner table and an ache that no economic boom could fill. One might say that prosperity in the 1920s was, in a sense, built on the sacrifices of those lost. Their absence nudged societies to invest in the living, to make life better in memory of the fallen. As we proceed, we will see how those absent voices perhaps indirectly influenced labor practices, urban improvements, and demographic shifts. But as far as the economists were concerned in the 1920s, the world had weathered the storm and was sailing forward, a bit battered but intact. In this calm reflection, we appreciate that while money and output can be restored relatively quickly, the true cost of the pandemic lay in the human capital and potential that vanished. Even so, humanity pressed on, proving that the engines of farms, factories, and trade, powered by human grit, could overcome even the dire blow of 1918. Labor, urban life, and demographic changes. In the tapestry of history, great tragedies often leave behind subtle shifts in the patterns of everyday life. The 1918 influenza pandemic, by taking so many lives so swiftly, inevitably altered the composition of communities, the rhythms of work, and the makeup of populations. In this section, we examine how the world's labor force, urban environments, and demographic trends were affected in the aftermath of the pandemic. These changes were not as dramatic or immediate as those wrought by the war, but they were present, threads woven into the fabric of the 1920s and beyond. We will see how labor markets adjusted to the sudden loss and later replenishment of workers, how city life resumed with perhaps new awareness of public health, and how population dynamics, births, deaths, migrations were nudged in new directions. All of this we do in a measured tone, observing the quiet resilience of workers and city dwellers adapting to a post-pandemic reality. One of the most direct effects of the pandemic was on the labor force. The death of working age adults in large numbers created, if only briefly, labor shortages in certain sectors. This was particularly true in industries or regions where the toll was high. For example, American railroads in late 1918 were scrambling to hire and train replacements as many railway employees had died or were incapacitated. Similarly, in Bombay's textile mills or South Africa's gold mines, the loss of experienced hands meant a sudden demand for new workers. Unemployment, which could have been a problem with so many soldiers returning from war, was partly mitigated by the fact that the pandemic had sadly created vacancies in the workforce. In this way, the war and the flu together shuffled labor in unexpected ways. An insightful outcome was that women's role in the workforce, already expanded during WWI, remained significant after the pandemic in some areas. During the flu, many women had stepped into roles as nurses, factory workers, and even civil servants to replace sick men. After the pandemic, not all returned to domestic life. Labor statistics from the 1920s in the US and UK show a modest but real increase in the proportion of women employed compared to 1910s. Part of this was the momentum of women's emancipation, culminating in suffrage in many countries around that time. Part may have been because there were simply fewer men of working age, so women's labor continued to be needed. For instance, a young widow might take up her late husband's job or a similar role to support her family, whereas in earlier times, societal norms might have kept her at home. The pandemic, in this sense, nudged forward the trend of women in the workplace that the war had accelerated. In terms of labor rights and conditions, the pandemic's memory added weight to demands for better workplace health measures. There was a newfound recognition that workers were not just units of production, but vulnerable humans whose health mattered. Some forward-thinking companies began offering paid sick leave or medical benefits in the 1920s, practices that were rare before. Although it's hard to attribute directly, one can surmise that business owners who saw entire departments shut down by illness realized that encouraging workers to stay home when sick, rather than come in and infect others, was actually in their interest. Progressive era reforms, such as improving factory ventilation and sanitation, received an extra boost of justification from the pandemic experience. The idea of the open-air workplace, when feasible, and sunlit, airy factory floors was promoted by industrial architects, not only for worker comfort, but for health, given the widespread belief that fresh air could ward off influenza and tuberculosis. In some industries, masks had been worn during the 1918 outbreak. While routine mask wearing did not continue afterward, people were quite happy to fling off their masks when the danger passed, as a Seattle teenager cheerfully noted in her diary. No more masks, everything open too. There remained an awareness that in any future epidemic, similar measures would be needed. Thus, workplaces quietly incorporated pandemic contingency plans into their thinking. This was rarely formalized in writing, but when the next big flu pandemic struck in 1957, some companies dusted off practices that had essentially been folkloric knowledge from 1918. Urban life, perhaps more than rural, bore visible marks of the pandemic for a time. In the immediate months after the waves, cities were eager to reassert normalcy. Streets once again filled with crowds. Streetcars clanged through city centers. Children returned to schoolyards. But observers noted a few lasting changes in behavior. For a while, people were more cognizant of personal space. The habit of refraining from spitting in public, which had been heavily advertised during the flu, seems to have stuck to some degree. A 1921 health report from New York City happily noted a sharp decline in cases of communicable respiratory diseases, attributing it to greater care by the public in matters of hygiene learned during the pandemic. Indeed, the early 1920s saw lower than average influenza levels, perhaps due to residual immunity in the population, but public health measures took credit. In some cities, permanent public health education offices were established. For instance, Chicago set up a municipal tuberculosis sanitarium and a Bureau for Health Education that also dispensed advice on flu prevention each winter. These offices often emerged from the infrastructure created to fight the 1918 flu, which then didn't entirely disband, but rather pivoted to general health promotion. City planning and housing were also subtly influenced. The pandemic underscored the dangers of overcrowded tenements and poor ventilation. Reformers who had long campaigned for better housing now had a powerful new argument. Good housing is not just morally right, it can save lives in a pandemic. Some cities revised building codes to mandate more windows or airflow, and efforts to de-densify slums gained traction. For example, New York had already passed tenement reform laws in the 1900s, but by the 1920s they pushed harder for slum clearance, though Great Depression and later New Deal programs would actually implement much of it. In British India, where epidemics were common, colonial authorities belatedly looked at urban sanitation anew. There were attempts, limited admittedly, to improve water supply and drainage in cities like Bombay and Calcutta in the 1920s, partially so that disease outbreaks would not again ravage the colonial economy. However, these efforts were often half-hearted and constrained by budgets. Demographically, the pandemic's most immediate effect was that millions of people were simply gone, with ripple effects on population structure. The loss was disproportionately among young adults, which meant a temporary dip in birth rates, as mentioned earlier. Indeed, data from several countries show a noticeable decline in births in late 1918 and 1919. Many potential parents had died, and others postponed having children amid the crisis. In the United States, births dropped in 1919. Some analyses attribute this to the influenza baby bust, and then spiked in 1920, producing a small baby boomlet. A similar pattern occurred in neutral European countries like Sweden and Norway. A dip and then a rebound. Countries involved in the war had overlapping factors, soldiers away or killed. But overall, by the mid-1920s, the birth rates stabilized to pre-war, pre-pandemic trends in many places. In India, where mortality was catastrophic, the population growth rate slowed markedly for a couple of years. Some provinces recorded millions of excess deaths in their census, and it took until the mid-1920s for the population to catch back up to its expected trajectory. Intriguingly, the influenza also left a mark on the health of the generation born around it. Researchers much later discovered that people who were in utero during the pandemic, whose mothers caught flu while pregnant, had higher rates of health problems in later life, such as heart disease or lower lifetime income, a subtle demographic echo of the trauma. This was not known at the time, of course, but it reminds us how population health events can cast long shadows. Migration patterns after the pandemic also resumed or shifted. The early 1920s saw large movements, Europeans emigrating to the Americas, though the U.S. imposed new immigration quotas in 1924, Chinese and Indian labor migration continuing to Southeast Asia, etc. One might think the fear of disease would have curtailed travel, but once the pandemic was over, human mobility picked up vigorously, perhaps with an element of people seeking fresh starts after so much death. For instance, it's in literature of the 1920s, we often see characters traveling the world. There was a kind of restlessness. On a macabre note, some places that had discouraged outsiders during the pandemic, like some Pacific islands that quarantined, became more open again. American Samoa reopened its port in 1920 after having perfectly kept the flu out. Ironically, when a less severe flu arrived there in 1921, some population with no prior exposure got sick, but still hardly any died. It showed that isolation saved lives in 1918, but couldn't be permanent. Similarly, cities built memorials, or markers where victims had been buried hastily in 1918. For example, some mass graves from 1918 were later given proper tombstones or memorial plaques in the 1920s, when communities had the chance to acknowledge what happened. This was a demographic footnote. In places like northern Canada or Alaska, collective memory of the horrific losses, some villages nearly wiped out, led survivors to sometimes relocate to larger towns for psychological and practical reasons. Some small settlements were abandoned after 1918 because too many of their inhabitants had died and the survivors merged into other communities. Thus, we see a minor but poignant consolidation of population in certain remote areas. What of the social fabric in cities? After the shared experience of the pandemic, there was often a sense of, we went through this together. In neighborhoods, people who had nursed each other's families formed bonds. Conversely, in some places, there was lingering bitterness. For instance, in neighborhoods where authorities had imposed strict quarantines or where certain groups were scapegoated. During the flu, some immigrants or ethnic minorities were unfairly blamed, just as in some U.S. cities, newspapers tried to pin the origin on, say, the Chinese, recalling old tropes. This tended to dissipate afterward because it was clear the flu spared no group, but those scapegoating moments may have left a bit of distrust. Meanwhile, volunteerism that had surged during the pandemic, like Red Cross nurses and community kitchens, left a legacy of stronger civic organizations. The American Red Cross, for example, saw its reputation burnished by its pandemic work, and it remained a major civic force in peacetime. Many Red Cross nurses who served in 1918 went on to become public health nurses in the 1920s, continuing to serve impoverished communities. These individuals carried forward the pandemic's memory in their life's work, quietly improving health and hygiene in city slums and rural villages to honor those they couldn't save. One demographic curiosity: the pandemic created a bulge of orphans and widows. For years afterward, there were more single-parent households and orphaned children being raised by relatives or institutions. Some older children quit school to work when a breadwinner died, This likely led to small upticks in child labor or lower educational attainment for that cohort, although the 1920s were also a time of child labor reform. So many of those orphans were eventually absorbed into new welfare systems or extended family networks. Governments did not do much specifically for flu orphans. They typically fell under general charity, but in places like the U.S., the 1920s did see the first widows' pension programs, for war widows primarily, and gradually the idea that the state might support fatherless or motherless children. It's not a stretch to think the pandemic nudged this conversation by increasing the number of affected families. Sociologists of the time wrote about the need for mothers' pensions so that widowed mothers wouldn't have to give up kids to orphanages. Such pensions were indeed implemented in many U.S. states in the 1910s and 20s. While spurred by general progressive era concerns, the plight of flu widows likely provided further impetus. In rural areas, demographic impact included the loss of community leaders. Imagine a small town losing its only doctor or several teachers. Some communities took time to replace those skills. On the other hand, returning war veterans who survived both war and flu often stepped into civic roles. The 1920s saw many veterans become doctors, lawyers, mayors, etc. Their worldview had been shaped by these twin experiences, and they often championed progress and international cooperation, the generation of Wilson and the League, albeit that failed politically in the U.S. It's fascinating that two devastating experiences hit that generation in succession, the war and the pandemic, and together they fostered a certain determination to build a better world, seen in movements like international public health efforts. For example, surviving medics from World War I and the pandemic became leading voices for global disease surveillance and vaccination campaigns in the 1920s and 30s, aiming to prevent such suffering in the future. This cross-pollination of war and health experiences enriched the burgeoning field of epidemiology, as discussed earlier, and the concept of social medicine. Urban culture in the 1920s, the jazz, the cinema, the nightclubs, thrived in part because people had a new appreciation for the pleasures of life and assembly. There's a sense in which the end of gathering bands unleashed an exuberance. Theaters reopened in 1919, often to packed audiences starved for entertainment. The New York Times reported in early 1919 about the triumphant return of Broadway shows after the flu closure. People dressed to the nines, laughing in unison, scenes of collective joy that perhaps were intensified by the memory of empty streets and silence months before. Thus, urban social life not only resumed, but might have become even more energetic, as if in defiance of the recent darkness. Finally, let's consider subtle mental shifts in populations, demographics of attitude, if you will. Having faced death at home, not just reading about it from battlefields, many people emerged with a different outlook on risk. Some became more cautious, cherishing health, while others became more daring, living for the moment. This is hard to quantify, but diaries and literature reflect both tendencies. Some individuals who lost loved ones retreated into more sheltered, conservative living, while others flung themselves into the excitement of the 1920s, saying you only live once. Both are human responses to trauma, and indeed, society in the 1920s had that dual nature, a frenetic modernity and also a nostalgic clinging to traditional comforts. The pandemic was one contributor to that complex psyche. In some, the world's labor systems, cities, and populations adapted in the wake of the pandemic. The adjustments were often quiet and pragmatic. Workers replaced, roles shifted, housing improved incrementally, children cared for by relatives, communities remembering their dead in personal ways while moving forward. Demographically, after a jolt, growth resumed, a testament to life's continuity. By the late 1920s, a casual observer might not easily discern that a massive pandemic had occurred a decade earlier. The streets were full, the factories humming, the families forming anew. But if you looked closely, you'd see its echoes, a missing generation in the population pyramid, a widow managing a store, a park named in honor of a beloved town doctor who gave his life, a hospital wing built with funds donated so that what happened in 1918 never happens again. These were the threads of change woven into daily life. The pandemic, though often forgotten, left the world a subtly changed place, in workforce composition, in urban planning, in the very compositions of families and communities. And as those changes settled, the world moved forward, carrying the memory of those lost in the collective heart, even as it embraced new life and growth. Advances in science and medical education. If there was a silver lining to the dark cloud of the 1918 influenza pandemic, it was the impetus it gave to scientific and medical advancements. The colossal failure to prevent or cure the flu in 1918 was a humbling experience for the medical community. At that time, doctors and researchers were confronted by a disease they could barely understand, let alone stop. This catalyzed a new determination to expand medical knowledge and improve training for health professionals. In the 1920s and beyond, significant strides were made in virology, immunology, and medical education, many of which can be traced back to lessons learned during the pandemic. In a calm and thoughtful tone, let us explore how those post-pandemic years became a period of remarkable scientific progress, sowing seeds that would flower as modern medicine. First and foremost, the 1918 pandemic was a great scientific mystery that demanded solving. At the time, most experts mistakenly believed that influenza was caused by a bacterium, Haemophilus influenzae, also known as Pfeiffer's bacillus, because that was the germ some had isolated from flu patients' lungs. However, during the pandemic, some meticulous physicians noticed that this bacterium couldn't be found in all patients, and even when present, it didn't always seem to cause the disease. This conundrum pushed a few pioneering scientists to hypothesize that influenza might be caused by something even smaller, an ultramicroscopic virus. It's poignant to note that in 1918, the concept of virus was still relatively new. Viruses could not be seen under light microscopes or cultured in labs like bacteria could. The pandemic underscored how little was known about these mysterious agents. In the early 1920s, research into influenza's cause intensified. Pathologists like Dr. William Welch, the eminent Johns Hopkins figure who had been shocked by what he saw at Camp Devens, encouraged young researchers to look beyond known bacteria. By 1931, this line of inquiry paid off when American researcher Richard Shope isolated a flu virus from pigs, and in 1933, British scientists Wilson Smith, Christopher Andrews, and Patrick Laidlaw isolated the human influenza A virus, finally confirming that influenza was indeed caused by a virus, not a bacterium. These breakthroughs, though occurring about 15 years after the pandemic, were direct descendants of the post-1918 push to solve the riddle. The virus itself from 1918 would eventually be reconstructed and studied many decades later, but already by the 1930s, the scientific legacy of the pandemic was clear. Virology had been propelled to the forefront. Another immediate scientific stride was in developing vaccines and treatments, or at least attempting to. During the pandemic, with no antiviral drugs, doctors tried everything from quinine to arsenic, mostly in vain. Afterward, there was a collective sense of never again and a flurry of experiments. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company trial in 1919 to 1920, mentioned earlier, was one early example. They funded what amounted to one of the first multi-center controlled clinical trials to test a treatment, a pneumonia anti-serum. The trial, involving alternating patients to receive serum or not, taught valuable lessons about clinical research, including the need for rigorous controls to avoid bias. Though that particular anti-serum had limited effect, since flu pneumonia often was viral, not just bacterial, the methodology pioneered informed later randomized controlled trials, which became the gold standard for testing new therapies by the mid-20th century. In this way, the pandemic indirectly spurred improvements in how we scientifically evaluate treatments. One of the most significant advances in medical science post-1918 was the growth of immunology and vaccine research. Before the pandemic, vaccines existed for diseases like smallpox and rabies, but the science of immunology was still developing. The shock of influenza's toll spurred funding and interest in preventing infectious diseases more broadly. Throughout the 1920s, researchers improved vaccines for diphtheria, pertussis, whooping cough, and tuberculosis. The BCG vaccine was introduced in 1921. While not directly flu vaccines, these developments were part of a larger momentum in preventive medicine. The mindset shifted. If we couldn't yet conquer influenza, perhaps we could at least eliminate some of its deadly companions or secondary infections. Indeed, pneumonia, often a secondary bacterial infection after influenza, became a major focus. The pandemic had shown how bacterial pneumonias killed many flu patients, so in the 1920s, scientists worked on pneumococcal vaccines and anti-sera. They had partial success, and more importantly, the groundwork laid that eventually led to effective pneumonia treatments once antibiotics arrived in the 1940s. Similarly, the nascent field of antibiotic discovery can trace a line back to this era. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, a mere decade after the flu, in a world newly conscious of deadly bacterial infections. One wonders if Fleming's urgency to find better infection fighters was influenced by what he saw during the war and pandemic. Medical education underwent a transformation as well. The pandemic exposed gaps in training. Many doctors felt helpless and ill-informed on how to manage an epidemic. In the U.S., the aftermath coincided with the implementation of the 1910 Flexner Report reforms, which had called for more rigorous, science-based medical training. Schools of medicine accelerated those reforms, emphasizing bacteriology, pathology, and public health in curricula so that future physicians would be better equipped. Moreover, the trauma of 1918 spurred the creation of specialized courses and programs in epidemiology and public health. We've noted how Johns Hopkins established the first academic Department of Epidemiology in 1919 with Wade Hampton Frost. Other universities soon followed with courses in statistical analysis of disease, sanitary science, and tropical medicine. As influenza had been a global disease, interest in international health also grew. A notable consequence was the emergence of the physician-scientist and the growth of research institutions. Philanthropic organizations, Rockefeller Foundation, for example, invested heavily in medical research in the 1920s, funding schools of public health, like the one at Hopkins or Harvard's, established 1922, institutes for virus research, and international health boards. The Rockefeller Foundation, in particular, set up virus research labs and sent scientists around the world to study diseases like yellow fever and influenza. Their Virus Research Commission in the 1930s built on techniques and infrastructure that had been started due to the influenza pandemic impetus. In parallel, there were improvements in public health infrastructure from a scientific standpoint. Health departments began employing epidemiologists to do outbreak investigations systematically. A legendary figure, Joseph Goldberger, for instance, used epidemiologic methods in the 1920s to prove pellagra, a disease rampant in the post-war South, was due to vitamin deficiency, not infection. While not influenza-related, the spirit of epidemiology, tracking patterns, testing hypotheses, was very much empowered by the experiences of the pandemic. Public health officials had seen that good data could guide policy, as when some cities still used graphs of case counts to decide on closures. Thus, the 1920s saw the expansion of national vital statistics systems. By 1933, all U.S. states were part of the death registration area. In 1918, many were not, meaning the country finally had nationwide mortality tracking. This was a foundational step for future public health monitoring. Another advance was in health communication and international collaboration. The newly formed League of Nations Health Organization, LNHO, in the 1920s created an early warning system for epidemics, sharing information among countries. They even organized cross-country studies on diseases. For influenza, they kept an eye on its seasonal patterns, though they didn't yet have the tools to predict new pandemics. The LNHO also standardized vaccines and antitoxins internationally. This spirit of cooperation in health was absolutely a reaction to 1918. Nations realized infectious diseases don't respect borders, and scientists from different countries needed to talk to each other. People like Dr. Ludwig Reichmann of Poland, who led the LNHO, were partly motivated by the devastation they'd seen from diseases during and after the war: typhus, cholera, flu. The LNHO's legacy would eventually flow into the creation of the World Health Organization after World War II. It is also worth noting how medical literature and documentation improved. After 1918, numerous studies, monographs, and official reports were published analyzing the pandemic. For instance, the British Ministry of Health in 1920 published a detailed report on the pandemic of influenza, 1918 to 19, filled with data and recommendations. This and similar documents served to educate future generations of doctors. They also often included frank admissions of ignorance, which in itself was progress, as it highlighted what needed to be studied. Even within the pandemic, some medical journal articles had been written, e.g., a famous one by Dr. George Soper in 1919 titled The Lessons of the Pandemic, questioning why the usual measures failed. All this introspection created a treasure trove of knowledge that researchers could build on. The ethos of research changed too. Prior to World War I, medical research was not as institutionalized. Afterward, it became a recognized career path. Governments and universities put more funds into research labs. For example, the U.S. Army, humbled by how illness had affected troops, more U.S. soldiers died of flu than combat in WWI, invested in its Army Medical School and later the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research to study infectious diseases among soldiers. The Navy did similar with its medical research endeavors. Finally, let's talk about nursing and medical practice on the ground. The pandemic elevated the status of nurses. Their heroism was widely acknowledged. After the war and flu, nursing schools saw increased enrollment, and there was an effort to formalize public health nursing as a specialty. Many countries expanded training for nurses, midwives, and sanitary inspectors in the 1920s, focusing on community health, hygiene, and preventive care. This was partly because 1918 showed hospitals could be overwhelmed. Better community care and home nursing would be critical if such an event happened again. Doctors' approach to patients also had a subtle shift. The pandemic had taught humility and the importance of holistic care. Since they had so few medicines to offer, many learned the value of basic supportive care and compassion. Some memoirs of physicians from the 1920s reflect on how that trial by fire made them better practitioners. One doctor wrote, "We could do little, but we could be there, and that was not nothing." That attitude underscored the human side of medicine. In conclusion, the world of science and medicine after the 1918 pandemic was invigorated by a resolve to conquer infectious disease and to educate healthcare providers better. The 1920s were a fertile period. The underpinnings of modern virology were laid, immunology blossomed, clinical research methods improved, and training for doctors and nurses became more scientifically rigorous and public health oriented. It was as if the pandemic's devastation lit a torch in the labs and lecture halls across the world, a flame of inquiry and innovation that has never since been extinguished. The calm we have in acknowledging this is one of gratitude. The loss of 1918 was not in vain, for it compelled humanity to understand and thereby better control the invisible pathogens that share our world. The advances born from that time would in later years enable the creation of influenza vaccines, antiviral drugs, and a deeper comprehension of pandemics, tools that those in 1918 could only dream of. Thus, through science and education, the pandemic's legacy lives on as a guardian for future generations, an enduring light against the darkness of disease. Cultural and artistic reflections of the pandemic. The influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919 unfolded in the midst of a world already convulsed by war, and in its immediate wake, people were often eager to focus on life rather than death. As a result, the pandemic left surprisingly scant direct traces in art, literature, and popular culture of the time. And yet, if one looks closely, the shadow of the pandemic flickers in the creative works of the 1920s and beyond, sometimes as a ghostly presence, other times as a central theme shrouded in metaphor. In this section, we explore how writers, artists, and musicians responded to, or conspicuously ignored, the great influenza. The tone here is gentle and reflective, for we are delving into the realm of human expression and memory, areas where the pandemic's imprint is subtle but profound. One striking fact is that few major novels or films of the 1920s feature the influenza pandemic prominently. Unlike the Great War, which immediately inspired volumes of poetry, memoirs, and battlefield novels, the flu's story was often left untold. This absence has intrigued scholars, some of whom dubbed the Spanish flu the forgotten pandemic, partly for this cultural silence. Several reasons have been proposed. The trauma was too personal and diffuse for a single narrative. It lacked clear heroes and villains, or dramatic battle scenes, and the war itself overshadowed it in the public imagination. Additionally, the flu's victims often died in isolation, in sickbeds and makeshift hospitals, which didn't lend itself to the kind of public commemoration that war memorials did. So in the Roaring Twenties, with society focused on jazz, modernism, and social change, the pandemic lingered more as a backdrop than a foreground in art. However, as time passed, individual stories and reflections began to emerge. A powerful early literary response came from Catherine Ann Porter, an American writer who nearly died during the 1918 pandemic and lost her fiancé to it. For years, Porter found the subject too painful to address directly. But in 1939, she published the short novel Pale Horse, Pale Rider, widely regarded as one of the finest pieces of fiction on the pandemic. In this story, a young newspaper woman named Miranda, clearly reflecting Porter, falls ill with influenza and hovers between life and death, while her lover, a soldier named Adam, cares for her, only for Adam to succumb to the disease just as Miranda recovers. Porter's prose is poetic and dreamlike, capturing the fevered delirium of illness and the surreal calm of a city under epidemic siege. She writes of silence in the streets and an invisible scourge, invoking Revelation's pale rider, death. When Miranda awakens, weak but alive, she experiences profound grief and a sense that the world is forever changed, observing that now there would be time for everything, but feeling only emptiness. Through Miranda's eyes, Porter articulates the disillusionment and quiet devastation of those who survived. As one reviewer later noted, no novel captures the twilight atmosphere of 1918 America, the intermingling of war and plague, love and loss, better than Porter's. Porter's work was ahead of its time in giving voice to the pandemic's emotional truth, and it helped set the stage for later literary acknowledgments of the event. Another literary figure, Thomas Wolfe, alluded to the pandemic in his sprawling novel, Look Homeward, Angel, 1929. Wolfe's own brother died of influenza, and in the novel he describes a character's death from flu in visceral detail. The burning fever, the desperate gasps for air, though he doesn't label it influenza, the time frame and symptoms make it clear. Wolfe's treatment is brief but powerful, showing how the pandemic wove into family histories. Similarly, in Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, the 1929 war novel, there's a subtle reference. The protagonist Frederick Henry mentions that the only warning of peace was the sudden end of the influenza, implying how entwined the war and pandemic's timelines were. Hemingway, who lost friends to the flu, typically kept the focus on war trauma, but that passing nod indicates awareness. Poetry of the era also holds echoes. T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland, 1922, channels a post-apocalyptic sense of a world laid waste by unseen calamities, often read as commentary on the war, but lines like, "He who was living is now dead, we who were living are now dying," resonate uncannily with the pandemic's toll. Eliot's own wife was very ill during the flu. They both caught it, actually, in December 1918. And while the wasteland is dense with illusions, the pervasive imagery of sterility and desolation fits a world recovering from mass death. W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet, wrote The Second Coming around January 1919 during his wife's influenza convalescence, and in the immediate aftermath of not just war, but also the deadly flu wave in Ireland. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold, he wrote, as well as mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. These lines have often been linked to political turmoil, but Yeats's personal context included the pandemic. It's as if the chaos and dread of the plague contributed to the poem's apocalyptic vision of a world on the brink of collapse. In the visual arts, Edvard Munch's self-portrait with the Spanish flu, 1919, stands out, as we discussed earlier. Munch, famous for the scream, turned his artist's eye on himself, recovering from influenza. The painting shows him pallid, weakened but alive. Munch lost many friends to the flu and captured the vulnerabilities of illness in that work. Pale greens and grays convey the sick room's atmosphere. Another artist, Egon Schiele, painted his wife Edith on her deathbed in 1918. He drew a few heartbreaking sketches of her. Gaunt face. Both died within days. Those images were private at the time, but later exhibited stark reminders of influenza's personal tragedies. The pandemic also influenced performing arts in smaller ways. For example, the 1919 Broadway play Mary opens with a scene of characters wearing masks and making quips about influenza, a rare instance of direct reference, played for comedic effect to lighten the audience's mood after a grim year. Some producers knew the shared experience could be gently acknowledged, then put aside for escapism. Popular music reflected the pandemic in a few notable cases, particularly in African American blues. In 1919, Essie Jenkins recorded the 1919 Influenza Blues, a haunting song whose lyrics go, "It was 1919. Men and women were dying with the stuff that the doctor called the flu. People were dying everywhere. Death was creeping through the air." She even cast the outbreak in religious terms, with a chorus about God's judgment and a need to repent. This song, like a few other influenza blues from that period, was a form of oral history. It documented not just the fact of the pandemic, but the feeling, the mournful tone of lost loved ones, and the search for meaning. Such blues songs were regional and did not become universally famous, but today they serve as cultural artifacts of how communities processed the tragedy. There were also some upbeat ragtime numbers, like Influenza Rag, 1919, that tried to make cathartic humor of the ordeal. One includes lyrics about sneezing and quarantining, suggesting that by 1919, people were ready to laugh off the nightmare, at least in music halls. Film, the burgeoning medium of the 1920s, surprisingly didn't tackle the pandemic directly in those years. Hollywood largely stuck to escapism, comedies, romances, swashbucklers. But indirectly, the pandemic might have influenced the themes of some works. For instance, the 1922 German expressionist film Nosferatu, an adaptation of Dracula, can be read as a plague allegory. An evil force arrives by ship, causing a mysterious contagion that decimates a town. The imagery of pallbearers and rats evokes historical plagues, but viewers in 1922 might have thought of the recent influenza in scenes where townsfolk panic and self-isolate. Horror and fantasy became outlets to process fears of mass death that were hard to address head on. It's also enlightening to consider what didn't happen culturally, unlike after the Black Death in the Middle Ages, which led to a plethora of morbid art, dance macabre motifs, etc. Post 1918 culture was largely about moving forward, the Art Deco aesthetics, the Jazz Age joie de vivre, the modernist break with old forms. The bleak experience of war and flu perhaps convinced artists to embrace innovation and living in the now. The motto, "Live fast, die young," could ring differently knowing how randomly death had struck. In literature, the lost generation writers like Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and others rarely mention the flu directly, but the pervasive sense of disillusionment, the fragility of life and love in their novels, surely drew from an era when both war and disease had shown how fragile existence could be. Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, 1925, doesn't mention influenza, but one of his lesser-known short stories, Christmas Fever, published in 1921, lightly references a family's ordeal with flu the previous winter, a sign that by 1921 it was part of domestic background. In the decades that followed, more cultural reflections emerged. As survivors aged, some wrote memoirs or spoke in interviews about 1918. In the 1970s, after the Hong Kong flu of 1968 rekindled interest, authors like William Maxwell penned a novel, They Came Like Swallows, 1977, which dealt tenderly with a Midwestern American family facing the 1918 flu. Maxwell had lost his own mother to the flu as a boy, and he poured that childhood grief into the novel, capturing the event through the eyes of two young brothers. By then, the subject was approached with nostalgia and poignancy, whereas the generation living through it had mostly chosen silence or obliqueness. In fine arts, the later 20th century saw some retrospective interpretations too. For instance, in 1993, artist Joel Shapiro created a series of sculptures titled Flu, abstract yet inspired by the skeletal forms of those ravaged by illness, but such direct references in visual art were rare until long after the fact. What we gather is that the pandemic's cultural imprint was like an invisible ink. At first glance, one might miss it, but when the right light is shown, it becomes clear. Much of the cultural output of the 1920s, its melancholy undercurrents, its carpe diem hedonism, its fixations on broken illusions, can be understood better knowing that society had just survived not only a war, but an even deadlier pandemic. The creative minds of the time responded in varied ways, some by turning away and painting brighter subjects, others by transmuting their sorrow into thinly veiled stories and songs. Over time, the pandemic has received more direct cultural acknowledgement, from novels like Thomas Mullen's The Last Town on Earth to HBO's recent Perry Mason series that incorporated the 1918 flu into its backdrop. And of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Spanish flu saw a resurgence of attention in media and arts as a point of reference. At the heart of cultural reflections on the 1918 pandemic is a gentle irony. The event that caused mass grief had for a long time a muted public memory, as if entombed in the hearts of survivors rather than commemorated in public art. But those hearts carried it into the works they created. Perhaps the pandemic lived on most in tone rather than content, the mournful lyric of a blues, the haunting aura of a poem, the Introspective mood of a novel's survivors. As readers or viewers, we sense something unspoken beneath the surface. In the calm of retrospect, we can identify it and pay tribute. These creative expressions, scattered and subtle, are indeed memorials to the pandemic's human impact. They remind us that behind every statistic was a story, and through art and culture, some of those stories, however quietly, found voice. Regional experiences and inequities. A comparative view. Up to this point, we have explored the aftermath of the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic through thematic lenses, noting common threads across different parts of the world. But it is equally important to recognize that the pandemic's impact and the world's recovery from it varied greatly by region and exposed sharp inequities. The experience of an American city dweller was not the same as that of an Indian villager or an African mine worker. In this section, we take a comparative look at several key regions: the United States, Europe, South Asia, focusing on British India, and a selection of colonial territories to highlight their unique experiences and the unequal burdens and responses witnessed. Throughout, the tone remains one of empathetic observation, acknowledging the disparities in suffering and response, and honoring the resilience shown in each context. United States, a fragmented yet forward-looking recovery. In the United States, the pandemic struck hard and swiftly, killing an estimated 675,000 people. It arrived in the final months of decades to the chaos of troop movements and home front mobilization. The aftermath in the U.S. was characterized by community-driven recovery efforts and an eagerness to move on, tempered by lessons that gradually informed public health. Different cities had markedly different outcomes during the flu, depending on their responses. As we saw, places like St. Louis fared better than Philadelphia due to timely interventions. These differences influenced local trust in authorities and subsequent health policies. For instance, St. Louis's health commissioner, Max Starkloff, became somewhat of a folk hero for his aggressive measures. His success gave credence to the idea that public health ordinances worked, encouraging other cities to follow suit in future epidemics. Philadelphia's tragedy, conversely, became a cautionary tale studied for decades. In the 1920s, the U.S. invested in modernizing health infrastructure. The Public Health Service expanded outreach, especially in rural areas that had been neglected. Many states created or strengthened their departments of health, employing more field nurses and sanitarians. While these changes were incremental, historians note a clear line from 1918 to subsequent improvements. For example, the inclusion of all states in a national mortality reporting system by 1933. Culturally, as discussed, Americans mostly wanted to celebrate peace and prosperity. The Roaring Twenties party scene, jazz clubs, dancing, flapper fashion, could be seen as collective catharsis after the double ordeal of war and flu. Yet underneath the glitter, the pandemic's memory quietly persisted in family stories and subtle cultural references, like the blues songs in the South. One notable inequity within the U.S. was along racial lines. African American communities often had less access to medical care and suffered high mortality, yet some studies suggest slightly lower flu incidence among Black Americans in certain cities, possibly due to less mobility or partial immunity from prior exposure to respiratory illnesses, a hypothesis posited by researchers. Nonetheless, Black Americans face structural racism in healthcare. For instance, many white-run hospitals refused Black patients. In response, some Black communities organized their own volunteer nursing brigades or used Black-owned hospitals where available. After the pandemic, there was a renewed push by African American leaders for better healthcare access and more training for Black nurses and doctors. One could argue that the 1918 pandemic fed into the larger narrative of racial injustice in America, becoming one more example of inequality. Though it was rarely addressed overtly in policy at the time, the Great Migration and fight for civil rights overshadowed specific pandemic memory. Socioeconomic inequity was also evident. The working poor, living in crowded conditions, endured higher death rates than the wealthy who could isolate or flee to country estates. This, as noted earlier, spurred some progressive reformers to intensify campaigns for housing and workplace improvements. In the long run, the U.S. emerged from the pandemic economically strong. It entered the 1920s as a creditor nation and enjoyed a boom. And the calamity of 1918 receded from national discourse until comparisons were drawn when COVID-19 hit in 2020. Europe, war-torn nations, and the overlapping trauma. In Europe, the influenza pandemic was like a deadly epilogue to an already devastating war. Major combatants like Britain, France, Germany, and Italy had each lost hundreds of thousands or more in battle, and now they lost comparable numbers to disease on the heels of armistice. The overlay of war and flu made it hard for Europeans to disentangle the causes of their suffering, and as such, the pandemic often blended into the general narrative of the terrible year of 1918. Many European countries did not extensively memorialize the flu as a separate event. For example, Britain's ceremonies and monuments honored the war dead and rarely mentioned the flu dead, even though in Britain the flu killed about $228,000, more than the country's civilian war casualties. That said, public health responses in Europe were notably influenced by the pandemic experience. Britain, for instance, established its Ministry of Health in 1919 and produced a detailed pandemic report. The ministry's first chief medical officer, Sir George Newman, prioritized improving national health to boost post-war recovery. The pandemic had shown that even a modern nation could be laid low by disease, so efforts were made to upgrade hospitals, create better disease surveillance, and coordinate medical research. However, due to economic constraints and political turmoil, post-war strikes, the Irish War of Independence, etc., changes were gradual. Interestingly, British society's stiff upper lip approach meant there was little outward mourning for flu victims beyond their immediate circles. Scholars have noted that no national memorial exists for them. Indeed, it wasn't until 2019, the centenary, that Westminster Abbey unveiled a plaque for the pandemic's victims. France was simultaneously rebuilding from physical war devastation and grappling with flu. French death tolls from influenza were high, perhaps around 240,000. The French government's response was somewhat fragmented due to the political chaos of 1919. Still, local authorities took cues from their experiences. Cities like Paris improved their health offices. France, like others, participated actively in the League of Nations Health Organization, perhaps motivated by the sense of vulnerability the pandemic imparted. French literature of the era, such as by Marcel Proust or the younger existentialists, seldom mentions the flu, but the pervasive themes of loss and fragility in the interwar cultural scene certainly echo it. Germany suffered grievously in 1918-19, defeat in war, revolutionary upheaval, famine conditions due to blockade, and then flu, which killed about 350,000 in Germany. For Germans, hunger and influenza were interlinked. Malnutrition likely raised flu mortality, especially among the working class. The Weimar government, under these pressures, instituted some progressive health measures. Weimar Germany was advanced in social medicine theory. For instance, there was expansion of public health clinics and a drive to improve child health to compensate for wartime neglect. German scientists, too, were at the forefront of pandemic investigations. Notable virologist Richard Pfeiffer had thought he found the pathogen, and when that theory fell apart, it propelled other German researchers to hunt the true cause. But like elsewhere, the war's imprint overshadowed the flu. Public monuments in Germany mourned fallen soldiers and war victims, not flu victims. Culturally, the despair and cynicism of German expressionist art, think of Edvard Munch's influence or the films of Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau, can be partly attributed to the convergence of war, revolution, and pandemic, a sense that the old world had died and chaos lurked. One cannot discuss Europe without noting Spain, ironically the country that lent the pandemic its name, because its uncensored press reported it widely. Spain, neutral in WWI, nonetheless was ravaged by the flu, an estimated 300,000 deaths. Spaniards called it the Naples soldier, or more often simply La Gripe. The Spanish government, lacking wartime censorship, had more open discussion during the event, but in the aftermath, Spain too had no grand memorials. Spanish intellectuals like physician Gregorio Marañón did write about lessons learned, and Spain's health ministry took steps to modernize. For example, by the mid-1920s, Spain had improved epidemiological reporting. But politically, Spain was unstable, rising unrest leading to a 1923 military coup, which likely shoved pandemic reform to the side. Across Europe, a key inequity was colonial versus metropolitan health. European colonial powers often scrambled to protect their troops and citizens, but did far less for colonial subjects. For example, during the pandemic, French authorities in West Africa and Indochina, and British authorities in Africa and India, prioritized quarantine measures that would keep Europeans safe, but they did not mobilize equivalent relief for native populations. After the pandemic, the colonial medical services did not significantly upgrade in response to the flu specifically, though some gradual improvements happened as part of broader interwar colonial policies. This leads naturally to examining South Asia and other colonies directly. South Asia, British India, the empire's greatest loss and the fuel for change. British India endured the worst mortality of any single region. An estimated 12 to 18 million Indians died in the pandemic, about 5% of the population. The carnage was exacerbated by factors like a poor harvest in 1918, causing malnutrition, the movement of returning soldiers and laborers who brought the virus to villages, and the almost non-existent health care in rural India. The colonial government's response was woefully inadequate. Overstretched by war effort demands and still following a laissez-faire approach to epidemics, apart from draconian plague measures earlier, which had sparked backlash. British officials did little beyond pious advisories. They neither imposed the kind of strict public closures seen elsewhere, except in a few cities, nor provided significant medical aid. Many British officials retreated to hill stations, leaving Indian volunteers, local leaders, and some low-level civil servants to do what they could. The aftermath in India was marked by deepened resentment against colonial rule. Indian newspapers and politicians lambasted the government's neglect. For instance, Mohandas Gandhi, himself sickened by the flu, he survived, though very weakened, saw the pandemic as evidence of the Raj's failure, and even wrote that such a plague was nature's revenge against British injustice. Gandhi's own personal loss, he mentioned the flu took some of his friends, and the broader devastation likely emboldened his resolve for Swaraj, self-rule. Indeed, the influenza struck right as India's freedom movement was gaining momentum. The tragic Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened in April 1919. Some historians suggest the shared suffering of the pandemic and Britain's indifferent response became part of the litany of colonial misrule fueling the independence narrative. Indian National Congress sessions in 1919 touched on health, demanding more Indian control over health administration. In terms of public health, the colonial government did take some steps after criticism mounted. The Indian Research Fund Association, IRFA, established in 1911, was given a bit more support. It later became the Indian Council of Medical Research. Investigations were conducted into why the death toll was so high. One outcome was an acknowledgement that widespread poverty and malnutrition had to be tackled, but colonial budgets and will were limited. Some provincial governments improved rural sanitation campaigns or tried recruiting more village-level medical practitioners, like Ayurvedic and Unani healers, since Western medical staff were too few. However, there was no fundamental improvement in healthcare delivery for Indians under the Raj that would await post-independence initiatives. The pandemic did imprint on Indian literature and memory in modest ways. Vernacular newspapers at the time gave heart-rending accounts. Hindi poet Suryakant Tripathi Nirala lost his family to the flu and wrote grieving verses, though not explicitly linking to the pandemic. The sorrow is evident. Indian society also responded at the community level. Many local charities and caste groups organized relief, distributing foods and medicines, what little they had, during the crisis. That tradition carried forward in subsequent disasters, a perhaps strengthened sense of local solidarity. Yet across India, an inequity remained stark. While the British official death rate was considerably lower, entire Indian villages were wiped out. In the central provinces, a report noted one district where not a single family escaped death. This left long-term demographic and social scars, countless orphans, labor shortages in some areas, until natural growth replenished them, and a dark memory that older generations quietly passed down. Other colonial territories, silent suffering and seeds of discontent. Beyond India, various parts of the colonial world experienced severe blows, often amplified by colonial policies or neglect. In Africa, for instance, the pandemic tore through communities already strained by war requisitions and often undernourishment. South Africa experienced one of the worst national death rates, around 3 to 6% of the population. Notably, black South Africans suffered hugely. Around 64% of all flu deaths in SA were among the African population, far out of proportion to their share. The apartheid-esque structures in 1918, with blacks crowded in poorly serviced urban locations, like the famous slums of Alexandra near Johannesburg, meant infection spread rapidly. White authorities did impose quarantines on black areas to try to protect white areas, even using armed guards to enforce them, which undoubtedly bred resentment. Some black communities, as the LSE blog recounts, were hit so hard that they were described as entirely wiped out. The aftermath for South Africa included a push by some white liberals and black leaders for better health provisions for the African population. A noteworthy figure, John L. Dube, first president of the African National Congress, wrote about the need to address such inequalities. However, the segregationist government's answer was half-hearted. They improved sanitation in black townships somewhat, perhaps fearing another outbreak could spill over, but fundamental inequities remained. Still, one can consider that this silent suffering added to the grievances that decades later fueled the anti-apartheid struggle, showing early on how little black lives seemed to matter to the authorities. Elsewhere in Africa, colonial administrations were often caught off guard. In Nigeria and Gold Coast, Ghana, the flu came along with returning soldiers and merchants. With minimal medical infrastructure, local populations relied on traditional healers and community help. Many died, especially among young adults, affecting village economies as productive members perished. Some historians note that this could have subtly weakened colonial economies. For example, cocoa farms in Ghana had labor issues in 1919 because many workers were recovering or gone. Did it spark anti-colonial sentiment? Possibly indirectly. If colonial rulers couldn't or wouldn't help in such dire times, it undercut their claimed benevolence. In Southeast Asia, notably Indonesia, Dutch East Indies, and Indochina, Vietnam, death tolls were also horrific. Dutch East Indies saw over 1 million dead, by some estimates. The pattern repeated. Colonial health services prioritized ports and Europeans. The indigenous population in remote areas was largely left to fate. Some Dutch officials later acknowledged that the pandemic revealed how poor the colony's public health was, and it led to a minor expansion of health programs in the 1920s, like a few more hospitals, but nothing commensurate with the need. For the colonized, the flu was one more tragedy under foreign rule, blending into famine and forced labor narratives that independence movements later invoked. In Vietnam, for example, the 1918 flu came amid growing nationalist unrest. While not a direct cause, the shared memory of suffering and French inaction likely fed general discontent. The Pacific Islands provide a dramatic case of uneven outcomes. As earlier mentioned, Western Samoa, under New Zealand's administration, lost about 22% of its people. New Zealand had allowed a ship from flu-ridden New Zealand to dock without quarantine, and the virus ravaged the Samoan population, who had little prior exposure to influenza. Meanwhile, American Samoa, just next door, enforced a strict maritime quarantine and had 0 flu deaths. This stark contrast between colonial stewardship became a flashpoint. Samoans deeply resented the New Zealand authorities, contributing to the rise of the Mau independence movement in the 1920s. Indeed, in 2002, the New Zealand Prime Minister formally apologized for the 1918 pandemic calamity in Samoa, an acknowledgement of colonial responsibility. Other Pacific isles like Fiji and Tonga also suffered high percentages of death, Fiji 5%. These small societies had oral traditions that preserved the tale of the time when many died. Culturally, it was a dividing line in memory, a source of sorrow recounted by elders to younger ones, sometimes with a sense of before and after the Great Sickness. Across colonized regions, a tragic pattern emerges: inequity in vulnerability and response. Generally, colonized peoples died at higher rates than those in imperial capitals, owing to factors like poverty, crowded living, malnutrition, limited access to health care, and often a lack of immunity due to less prior exposure to similar flu strains in isolated populations. The pandemic thus highlighted the global health divide, something that, as noted, spurred the League of Nations Health Organization to try and assist with diseases in colonized countries. However, the LNHO was limited in reach. It ran a few campaigns. States against malarious yellow fever in the 1920s, but influenza prevention remained elusive. Inequities within regions, class, and gender. Not to be overlooked, within any given region, class was a major determinant of outcome. In the United States and Europe, the wealthy could often escape cities or had spacious homes to isolate in. The poor lived in dense tenements where the flu spread unabated. As earlier cited, Britain saw its first year where deaths exceeded births in 1918, and this was heavily skewed by class. Working class districts had far higher mortality. Many contemporary commentators observed that influenza was democratic in that it infected rich and poor alike, but the aftermath showed it was far from equal in outcome. Those who started off healthier and better cared for had better survival odds. Gender also played a role. Interestingly, the 1918 flu had an unusually high mortality for pregnant women. A shocking number of expectant mothers who caught flu miscarried or died. Some estimates say a majority of pregnant flu patients died. This left a silent toll of women and unborn children. It possibly contributed to the dip in births after 1918. While men and women overall died in roughly equal numbers, with men slightly more in some stats, partly because of war-age men being affected, the social impact on women was notable. Many young widows suddenly headed households. Some entered work, as mentioned, altering gender roles slightly. The Roaring Twenties are often characterized by the new woman, independent, working, socially liberated. And while that owes much to broader social change, one could speculate that surviving a pandemic where traditional support systems faltered might have pushed some women toward greater autonomy. On the flip side, in places like India, mortality among women was extremely high. Some Indian provinces recorded more female than male deaths, possibly due to women's poor nutrition and later care seeking, which had family repercussions, e.g., more motherless children. In reflecting on these comparative experiences, what stands out is a sad but unsurprising truth. The pandemic magnified existing inequities. The powerful and privileged, be it nations or social classes, had more means to cope and recover. The marginalized often bore the brunt and were slower to recover. And yet, in every region, there was also remarkable resilience and adaptation. People learned, organized, and pressed for improvements. The world after the pandemic was not uniformly better for everyone. Far from it. But the shared ordeal did sow seeds of change, whether it was calls for self-rule in colonies, or demands for socialized medicine in Europe, or new public health institutions globally. As we conclude this regional comparison, we maintain a tone of respectful remembrance. From the hushed cemeteries of rural India to the bustling harbors of New York, from the plantations of the West Indies to the villages of West Africa, each community's story of 1918 to 1919 is unique and worthy of acknowledgement. In telling the history of the world after the 1918 influenza pandemic, we weave together all these threads, the triumphs and failures, the advancements and the inequities, to gain a full picture. It is a story of both unity and division. Unity in a common human vulnerability. Division in how unevenly the burden was carried, perhaps one lasting legacy of the pandemic, as seen through these comparisons, is a slowly growing consciousness among those who cared to see that the health of one truly does affect the health of all. It would take many more decades and other challenges for that to translate into robust global health equity, a goal we still chase today. But the pandemic of 1918 was a tragic early teacher of that lesson on a world scale. Conclusion: enduring lessons and the quiet legacy. As the 1920s progressed, the world emerged from under the pall of the 1918 influenza pandemic, rejuvenated in many ways, yet indelibly marked by the experience. The streets filled with life again, economies largely bounced back, and in popular memory the nightmare receded behind the brighter lights of a new era. Yet as we have seen, the pandemic's influence permeated the post-1918 world, shaping public health, scientific discovery, societal attitudes, and even the undercurrents of art and politics. It did so often in subtle, understated ways, much like the calm after a storm where survivors quietly rebuild. The world after the 1918 influenza pandemic was not a world transformed overnight, but a world nudged, in fits and starts, towards modern approaches to health and a deeper awareness of our interconnected fate. Public health reforms took root. Countries created health ministries, improved hospitals, trained epidemiologists, and cooperated internationally as never before. Trust in institutions was tested. In some places, it was strengthened by competent responses. In others, it was weakened, feeding movements for change or independence. Socially and psychologically, millions carried grief in their hearts, even as they danced, wrote, and strove for normalcy. Economically, disruptions were largely overcome, but not before highlighting the vulnerability of workers and the importance of safeguarding health for prosperity. Perhaps one of the pandemic's most enduring legacies is a quiet one. It fostered a greater empathy born of shared suffering. For all the inequities, there was also a sense that humanity had endured a common trial. In 1918 to 1919, no nation and no social class was completely untouched. An emperor in India, a president in Brazil, writers, teachers, farmers, and factory hands all fell ill. Some died, some recovered. This realization, at least among thoughtful observers, underscored that modern civilization, with all its prowess, was still at nature's mercy unless knowledge and compassion led the way. The famous scientist William Welch, surveying the devastation, reportedly said in alarm, "This must be some new kind of plague." A new plague, indeed, and one that taught new humility. For those who lived through it, the memory could be haunting. A British nurse recalled decades later the rows of patients and a feeling of helplessness, noting, "We felt we were in the presence of something we didn't understand." Such recollections would gradually spur improvements so that future generations might not feel that same helplessness. And indeed, the descendants of the 1918 virus could continue to circulate. Almost every flu since, including the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, has ancestral links to 1918. But armed with vaccines, antiviral drugs, and a century of medical progress, much of it springing from foundations laid in the 1920s, humanity would never again be so utterly blindsided by influenza. In the realm of culture, while the 1918 pandemic seldom took center stage, it served as a silent muse for those exploring themes of mortality and meaning. The calm, sleep-friendly storytelling traditions that speak of past eras, whether one is listening to a gentle narration of the fall of empires or the trials of a plague year, now include the story of the 1918 flu interwoven in the broader human narrative. As we drift into reflection, we may imagine the spirits of that time, a soldier in France writing a last letter as influenza closes his throat, a mother in India cradling her ailing child, a doctor in New York dozing exhausted on his desk amid case charts, a Samoan chief watching funerals day after day under the tropical sun. They could not speak to each other across oceans, but they were united by the same sorrow. Today, their experiences speak to us. They remind us to cherish health, to value science, and above all, to extend care to all our neighbors on this interconnected earth. The world after the 1918 influenza pandemic was not a utopia reborn. It had plenty of roaring and plenty of grieving left to do, but slowly it learned. As Laura Spinney aptly observed, the 1918 pandemic accelerated the pace of change in the first half of the 20th century and helped shape our modern world. Societies realized that public health is a public good, that transparency and preparedness save lives, and that even in the darkest times, human solidarity and ingenuity light the way forward. In drawing this immersive history to a close, we have journeyed through quiet hospital wards and bustling laboratories, through memorial pages and forgotten blues verses. We have seen the world in darkness and the dawn that followed. Let us end on a note of serenity and hope, the kind of calm hope one might have felt in 1919 when the wheeze of ventilators, primitive though they were, fell silent as the last patients healed, and spring brought new blossoms unfurling over mass graves. Out of great tragedy had come hard-won wisdom. The influenza pandemic of 1918-1919 slipped into the past, gradually becoming a memory, then a history, and now a lesson. Its victims are at peace, their stories folded into our collective heritage, and the world they left carried on, scarred but wiser, determined to live, to love, and to remember. In the gentle darkness, we honor them and find comfort in how far we have come, and we remain watchful stewards of the lessons they paid so dearly to teach. In the silence after the storm, the world took a deeper breath. Good night.